They called her invisible. The help. The plain one with the worn shoes and the downcast eyes who refilled champagne glasses and pretended not to hear the cruelty. For 3 years, Mara Voss moved through the shadows of Dante Marcel's penthouse like a ghost nobody bothered to haunt. But on the night his world cracked open, when bullets shattered the crystal and blood stained the marble, it wasn't his fiancée who pulled him through the dark. It wasn't his soldiers. It was her. The housekeeper they mocked. And before the night was over, he would place a billion-dollar ring on her finger in front of every person who ever looked through her. If this story already has your heart pounding, stay with me until the very end. Hit that like button, drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's begin. The ring arrived on a Tuesday. Not to Mara. Nobody sent Mara anything. It arrived in a velvet-lined case no bigger than a child's fist, carried up from the lobby by a courier in a gray suit who refused to make eye contact with anyone who didn't look important. He handed it directly to Sienna Vale, who stood in the center of the Marcel penthouse's main salon in a cream silk robe, her dark hair falling in rehearsed waves over one shoulder, her expression arranged into something between delight and entitlement. Mara saw the whole thing from the hallway entrance. She was carrying fresh linens, 2 sets for the guest suites, 1 set for the master, and she stopped walking because the courier's path cut directly across hers, and she'd learned long ago that stopping was safer than being walked through. Sienna opened the case, held it up toward the floor-to-ceiling windows where the Manhattan skyline burned gray and silver in the early morning light. The ring inside caught what little sun filtered through the clouds and threw a small spray of fractured light across the ceiling. Perfect, Sienna said, to nobody in particular. Or maybe to herself. Or maybe just to the ring. Mara shifted the linens in her arms and kept moving. She had been a housekeeper in the Marcel penthouse for 3 years and 4 months. She knew the exact square footage of every room. She knew which floorboards creaked near the east corridor and which didn't, and she knew that knowledge was worth more than it sounded because Dante Marcel's penthouse was not a normal residence. It occupied the top 2 floors of a building in Midtown that didn't appear on most real estate listings. The security team rotated every 48 hours. The kitchen staff signed NDAs so dense they were practically legal art. The guests who came through those doors, the ones who arrived in black SUVs with tinted windows and left before sunrise, were not the kind of people who forgot a face that didn't belong. Mara belonged, or she had made herself belong through 3 years of near-perfect invisibility. She was 34 years old. Brown hair, usually pulled back tight. Unremarkable features, the kind that a sketch artist would struggle to reconstruct with any confidence. She was not beautiful in any way that the women who passed through this penthouse would acknowledge. She was average height, average build, and she moved quietly and efficiently and kept her opinions behind her teeth where they couldn't cause problems. That was by design. Before this job, she had done 2 years as a paralegal at a mid-sized firm in Queens. Before that, 3 semesters of criminal justice at a city college she'd eventually stopped attending because the money ran out and the loans didn't. She had a mother in Yonkers who didn't ask too many questions. She had an apartment in the Bronx with a single window that faced a brick wall. She had a small scar along her left forearm from a kitchen accident 6 months into this job, and she had a habit of cataloging exits whenever she entered a room. That last habit was not something she'd learned in school. She put the linens in the guest suites and moved to the master, and as she was smoothing the fitted sheet over the corner of the bed, she heard Dante Marcel's voice in the next room. Not raised. Never raised. That was the thing about him that had surprised her most in the beginning. She had expected a man in his position to be loud, commanding by volume. But Dante spoke quietly, and people leaned in to hear him, and that leaning in was its own kind of power. She could hear him now through the thin wall that separated the bedroom from his private office. He was on the phone. She couldn't make out specific words, but she could read the cadence, the rhythm of the pauses, and what she heard told her the conversation was about money, and the money conversation was not going well. She finished the bed, gathered the used linens into the cart, left the room without making a sound. The engagement party was scheduled for that Saturday, 5 days away. Mara had already been handed a list of additional duties by Dante's household manager, a humorless man named Carver, who communicated almost entirely through printed memos and the aggressive clicking of his pen. The list was 2 pages, additional floral arrangements to receive and stage, additional guest rooms to prepare. A specific request from Sienna Vale's assistant, a woman named Petra, who called from a block number and had the verbal manner of someone who had been trained to communicate with service staff as though they were mildly disappointing software. That the second-floor powder room be stocked with a specific brand of hand soap that was not currently in the building. Mara added it to her own list. She kept her own list. It was a habit. The first thing she noticed about the florist's delivery on Thursday morning was the man carrying the second arrangement. She wouldn't have thought anything of it except that she knew the florist's team. Not personally, not beyond the professional nod of recognition that develops after you receive a delivery from the same company 17 times over 3 years, but she knew their faces. She knew the two women who always handled the penthouse account, and she knew the young guy with the sleeve tattoos who drove the van, and she knew the older man who supervised and wore a canvas apron and chewed spearmint gum constantly. The man carrying the second arrangement, a tall cascade of white orchids in a black vase, was not any of those people. He was maybe 40, medium build, with a forgettable face and very clean hands. Florists had dirty hands, or at least stained ones from the dyes and the soil and the stems. His hands were spotless. Mara watched him set the arrangement down on the console table in the west foyer, make a small adjustment to the position of one orchid stem, and then step back and pull out his phone and photograph it. That part wasn't unusual. The team sometimes photographed the arrangements for portfolio records. But he photographed it from 3 different angles, including one from below, and then he turned slightly and photographed the hallway behind him. Not the arrangement, the hallway. Mara moved before she'd consciously decided to move. She went to the kitchen, poured herself a glass of water she didn't need, and came back around the long way through the service corridor, which led out behind the foyer through a door concealed in the paneling. The man was gone. The arrangement was there. She looked at it. She looked at it for a long time, the way you look at something when your instincts are louder than your logic. Then she crouched down slightly and looked at the vase itself, which was heavy ceramic, matte black, and sealed at the top around the stems with a ring of florist's foam. The foam had been disturbed on one side, pushed back slightly, then repressed, but not with the smoothness of an original fit. There was a small crease in it, like a fingerprint left in clay. She straightened up, walked to the kitchen, told herself she was imagining things. She was not imagining things. She knew she was not imagining things because she had been in this building for 3 years, and her brain had been running the same background calculation for most of that time, logging anomalies the way a body logs symptoms. And this was not noise. This was signal. But it was not her business. That was the other calculation she was always running. What is my business and what is not? What do I see and what do I keep behind my teeth? She kept it behind her teeth until Friday afternoon, when she saw the ledger. She wasn't looking for it. That was the honest truth, and Mara had a thing about honest truth that sometimes felt less like a virtue and more like a compulsion she couldn't switch off. She was in Dante's private study to collect the used coffee cups. Carver had specifically asked her to do this every afternoon before 5, because Dante had a tendency to accumulate them and then become irritable about the clutter. And the study was empty, and the desk was not. On the desk, partially covered by a manila folder, was a leather-bound ledger. Old style, actual handwritten entries, the kind of record-keeping that existed precisely because it left no digital trace. It was open to a page near the middle. She could see columns of numbers, dates, names that meant nothing to her in isolation, and 2 initials repeated at the end of 3 separate entries. SV. She did not pick it up. She collected the coffee cups. She left the study. She did not say anything, but she went back to her list, and she added a line that was not a task and not a reminder, just a notation in the compressed shorthand she'd developed over years of keeping her observations to herself. And then she folded the paper and put it in the inside pocket of her uniform jacket where it wouldn't be visible. Saturday arrived with the particular pressure of a sky about to break open. The penthouse by 7 in the evening looked like a film set. Catering staff moved in choreographed patterns. The floral arrangements, including the white orchids, which Mara had watched without touching since Thursday, had been supplemented by additional displays in the salon, the dining room, and on both balconies. A string quartet had been set up in the corner near the grand piano and was currently playing something Mara didn't know the name of, but recognized from the last time she'd been in a hospital waiting room. She worked. That was what she did. She moved through the edges of the gathering as it swelled, adjusting things, anticipating needs, refilling things that needed refilling, removing things that needed removing. The guests arrived in waves, and they were the kind of people who treated every room they entered as an extension of their own living rooms, which meant they put things down wherever they felt like it, and expected those things to vanish and reappear in better locations without any visible mechanism. Mara was the mechanism. Sienna Vale came down the main staircase at 7:45 in a dress that had probably cost more than Mara's annual salary, and the room did the thing rooms do when a woman like that enters, which is to briefly reorganize itself around her. She had the ring on, the one from Tuesday's velvet case. It caught the chandelier light every time she moved her hand, which she did frequently and with a kind of practiced nonchalance that was anything but. Dante was already in the room, near the bar, in conversation with two men whose suits cost less than Sienna's dress, but whose postures suggested they were not the kind of men who thought about things like that. He wore a dark jacket, no tie, and the expression he almost always wore, which was the expression of a man who was paying attention to something you couldn't see. He noticed Mara when she came to replace an empty water pitcher on the bar station. Not in the way people usually notice service staff, which is to say, he didn't look through her. He looked at her for maybe 2 seconds, which, in the context of a room full of people performing their best versions of themselves for each other, was almost an abnormally long acknowledgement, and then he looked back at the two men. She replaced the pitcher and withdrew. The trouble started at 9:15. What? Mara was in the east hallway collecting appetizer plates when she heard the laughter. It wasn't the kind of social laughter that populated every corner of a party like this. That was ambient, textured, meaningless. This was directed. She could feel the direction of it the way you feel a cold draft from a specific point in a wall. She turned. 3 women, early 40s to late 50s, the range of wealth-preserved aging that blurred exact numbers. They were standing near the entrance to the sitting room, champagne flutes in hand, looking at her with the casual cruelty of people who have never needed to be careful about how they looked at anyone. "That's her," one of them said, not quietly. "The housekeeper?" The second one tilted her head slightly, like she was examining something at a museum. "Apparently she's been here for years. Dante keeps her on the staff personally." This from the third woman, who had the air of someone who considered herself a primary source on all things Marcel. "She looks like she shops at a hardware store." The first woman again, and the 3 of them produced the particular sound of women laughing at something that isn't funny to anyone outside their specific orbit. Mara's shoes were, in fact, practical, low-heeled, dark, non-slip. They were work shoes. She was at work. She did not look at the women. She continued collecting plates. "Plain as a paper bag, honestly," the third woman said. "I don't know how Dante stands it. There should be standards for this sort of thing." Mara moved to the next table. She was good at this. She had practice. She put her feelings in the back of her throat and held them there, and she focused on the task in front of her. And she told herself that the opinions of these women were less than 0 in the accounting of anything that actually mattered. She believed this. She believed it in the way you believe things that are true, but also hurt. What she didn't know was that Dante was standing in the archway 6 feet behind her. She found that out later. At the moment, she was just stacking plates and keeping her breathing even, and noting automatically and without meaning to, that the third woman, the primary source, had come in this evening with a man who was not her husband, if the absence of a ring was any measure, and that this man had been in conversation earlier with the clean-handed florist's assistant who was not actually from the florist. Not her business. She went back to the kitchen with the plates. At 9:50, she noticed the wine. She was setting out additional glasses on the service station near the dining room entrance when she saw one of the catering staff, a young man she didn't recognize from the agency's usual roster, switch 2 bottles from one side of the cooling station to the other. Small motion, routine-looking, the kind of thing you do if you were reorganizing for efficiency. Except the bottles he moved were the ones marked for Dante's personal service. She knew this because there was a small adhesive marker on the neck of each bottle, a mark that the head caterer used for high-priority table placements, and moving those bottles to the general pool didn't make any logistical sense. She watched the young man for another 30 seconds. He didn't look at her. She looked at the bottles. She looked at the young man. She made a decision. She picked up both bottles from where he'd moved them, walked them to the kitchen, and told the head caterer with complete calm that there had been a mix-up with the reserve labels, and these needed to be held from service until the caterer confirmed with Mr. Carver. The head caterer, a stressed woman named Dana, who had 3 things happening simultaneously and no patience for additional complications, told her fine, yes, handle it. Mara put the bottles in the back of the service pantry on a high shelf behind a box of extra napkin rings. She did not tell anyone else. She did not know, in that moment, what the significance of what she'd done was. She knew only that something was wrong in the pattern, and she had moved to correct it, and now she needed to think. She stood in the service pantry for 90 seconds with her hand flat against the cool metal of the shelving unit and breathed. Then she went back out to the party. At 10:20, she found the ledger again, except this time it wasn't on the desk where it had been on Friday afternoon. It was gone, and someone had been through the study. She knew because the room looked exactly as it should, except for 2 small things. The chair behind the desk had been rolled 2 inches to the right of where it always sat, which she knew because there was a slight compression mark in the carpet from its usual position, and the second drawer on the left side of the desk was not fully closed. Not open, just not fully closed, by maybe the width of a thumbnail. She pushed the drawer shut. She rolled the chair back to its position. She stood in the quiet of the study with the party noise filtering through from the other side of the penthouse, and she thought about the man with the clean hands and the wine bottles and the ledger with SV repeated at the end of entries she hadn't been close enough to read. She thought about Sienna Vale standing at the top of the stairs at 7:45 with the ring on her finger and the practiced way she'd moved her hand in the light. She thought about her own list, folded in her jacket pocket. She took out her phone. She did something she had specifically told herself she would not do. She opened the building's security camera app. She had the access code because she was part of the household management structure, and Carver had given it to her 18 months ago for operational purposes. And she navigated to the study camera. The footage from 9:42 showed a figure entering the study from the secondary door. Dark clothing, quick hands. The figure went directly to the desk, opened the bottom drawer on the right side, removed the ledger, photographed several pages with a small device, replaced it, and left. 23 seconds, start to finish. The figure had the same build, the same posture, the same forgettably clean hands as the man from the florist's delivery. Mara saved the clip to her phone's encrypted backup. Then she stood very still in the dark study and understood, with a clarity that felt less like revelation and more like confirmation of something she'd been sensing for days, that she was standing in the middle of something that could get her killed. She'd been standing in the middle of things like that before. The difference was that before, she'd had the option of walking away. She wasn't sure she had that option now. She went back to the party, smiled at no one, refilled 2 water glasses, and started trying to figure out who else in this room was not who they said they were. At 11:15, Sienna Vale looked across the salon and caught Mara's eye for the first time in 3 years, and smiled at her. It was a smile that knew something, that held something, and in Mara Voss's chest, something cold and certain settled in like a stone dropping into still water. She knew what that smile meant. She just didn't know yet that by morning, she would be the one standing before this entire room, accused of stealing the Marcel family ring. The smile stayed with Mara the rest of the night. Not the smile itself. She'd seen 1,000 versions of that smile in this building. The particular curvature of superiority that certain women wielded like a tool they'd inherited rather than earned. What stayed with her was the timing of it. Sienna Vale had never once, in 3 years and 4 months, directed any conscious expression toward Mara Voss. Not acknowledgement, not dismissal, not even the lazy contempt the 3 women near the sitting room had deployed so freely. Sienna had simply not registered Mara as a thing worth registering. Until tonight. Until 11:15 with champagne warming in crystal flutes and the quartet sawing through something slow and the room full of people who thought they understood the shape of the world they were standing in. The smile had been deliberate, which meant Sienna knew Mara had been watching, which meant either Sienna was significantly more perceptive than she appeared or someone had told her. Mara refilled a water glass near the east window and processed both possibilities with the same flat efficiency she brought to every problem she wasn't supposed to have. She was good at that. She had always been good at that, keeping the exterior smooth while the interior ran its own parallel calculation, fast and cold, and separate from everything her face was doing. The party continued dissolving into itself the way late-night parties did. The formality loosening, the voices getting louder, the careful social architecture of the early evening giving way to the messier and more honest geometry of people who'd had enough to drink to stop performing quite so hard. The string quartet had packed up at 11. Someone had connected a phone to the speaker system and the music was different now, lower, more rhythmic, a heartbeat under the conversation. Mara worked the room in tightening circuits. She was looking for the clean-handed man. She didn't find him. He was gone. Whether he'd left through the front with the other guests or through some other route, she couldn't tell without pulling security footage. She didn't have a pretext to pull right now, not with Carver circling the perimeter of the evening with his clipboard and his clicking pen. What she found instead, at 11:40, was a conversation she was not supposed to hear. She was moving through the secondary hallway that connected the dining room to the service corridor, carrying a tray of empty glasses, when she heard voices in the alcove around the corner. She stopped because she recognized one of them, not from its specific timbre, but from its rhythm, the way it clipped the ends of sentences, the particular cadence of someone who chose their words with the kind of precision that suggested they were aware their words might someday be quoted back to them in an unfavorable context. Sienna Vale, not get... Doesn't matter. By Monday, it's done. A man's voice, not one Mara recognized, lower than a conversational register, deliberate. If he finds the discrepancy in the third column before the ceremony, he won't. Flat, certain. He doesn't look at third columns, he looks at totals. And if the housekeeper is not your problem, a pause. She's mine. Mara did not move. She was aware of her own breathing in a way she usually wasn't, aware of the tray in her hands and the weight of the glasses and the small involuntary tension that had moved into her forearms. She stood in the hallway and did not move, and did not make a sound for what felt like a long time, but was probably 6 seconds. Then the voices shifted, moved toward the alcove's other exit, and she heard heels on the marble floor going away from her. She walked to the kitchen. She set down the tray. She stood at the sink and ran cold water over her wrists and focused on the sensation of it. She's mine. 2 words, the kind of words that had a lot of possible meanings, most of them bad. She dried her hands. She went back to work. She calculated, roughly 6 hours before the morning shift, and in those 6 hours she needed to make a decision that her brain kept trying to frame as simple. Leave, just leave, write the resignation, walk out. And that her gut kept rejecting as anything but. Because if she left with what she knew. And what she knew was currently only dangerous to the people who already thought she was a problem. Walking away from it didn't make it safer. It possibly made it worse, because a loose end walking around Queens with a job history at the Marcel penthouse and a head full of observations she hadn't shared with anyone was the kind of loose end that people in Sienna Vale's orbit had reasons to tie. She was still running that math at midnight when Carver dismissed the service staff, and she went down to the staff locker room on the 42nd floor and changed out of her uniform and sat on the bench in the narrow space between the lockers and the wall and took out her list. She read what she'd written, the notation about the ledger, the man with the clean hands, the wine bottles, SV repeated in the columns. She added, alcove 1140, the third column, by Monday. Then she folded the paper and put it back and sat there for another 3 minutes, doing nothing at all, which was something she almost never permitted herself, and it felt like standing at the edge of something and looking down. Sunday arrived wrong. She knew it from the moment she stepped off the elevator at 7:15 with her cleaning kit and her cart, and found Carver already in the foyer, which was unusual enough, but it was the way he was standing that told her something had broken overnight. He had the posture of a man who had received news he didn't know how to organize yet, and when he saw her he made a small motion with his hand that was somehow both a greeting and a demand. Marcel wants the full floor cleaned before 10, he said. Everything, including the study. The study is usually everything, he said again, and the way he said it a second time told her the instruction had come from above his authority, and that he didn't like it, and that he was passing the discomfort down the chain to her, which was the only direction Carver knew how to pass anything. She started on the guest suites. She worked from the outside in, the way she always did, moving toward the penthouse's center in a pattern that was efficient, and also gave her the widest possible visibility into what had changed overnight. And things had changed. She could tell from the specific disorder of certain spaces, the kind of disorder that wasn't random but directional, like someone had been moving through rooms looking for something specific. In the second guest suite, someone had moved the bureau 6 inches from the wall. She could see the marks in the carpet. They'd put it back, but not precisely back. In the small office adjacent to the salon, a painting on the east wall was 3 degrees off its original hang. She knew this because she'd straightened it herself 2 weeks ago and had noted the specific angle as a reference point. In the connecting hallway between the main and secondary staircases, 2 wall panels that she'd always understood to be decorative had recently been disturbed. The dust displacement around the lower edges told her that. Someone had been through this floor last night after the party. And whoever it was, they knew the floor plan well enough to move through it without triggering the alarm system, which meant either they had the codes or the codes had been given to them. She was cataloging all of this while cleaning, because that was the discipline she had built over years. Do the task in front of you and let your peripheral intelligence do the other thing simultaneously, and don't let either one show on your face. She was in the main salon, on her knees scrubbing a champagne spill from the floor near the fireplace, when Dante Marcel walked in. She heard him before she saw him. The specific sound of his walk, which was unhurried but always seemed to cover ground faster than it should. She looked up. He was in dark trousers and a white shirt with the cuffs rolled, and he was carrying a cup of coffee in one hand and a phone in the other, and he stopped when he saw her with the same particular quality of attention he'd given her at the bar station the night before. Not through her. At her. "Morning," he said. "Good morning, Mr. Marcel." She went back to the scrubbing. He didn't leave. She heard him step closer and stop again. She kept scrubbing. "How long does that take?" "About another 3 minutes." "How long have you been here this morning?" "Since 7:15. Another pause. She could feel him doing something with the silence, the way he did, and she did not look up. "Did anything seem unusual to you last night?" She stopped scrubbing. She sat back on her heels. She looked at him, and he was looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen on his face before. Not quite suspicion, not quite trust. Something in the narrow space between them, waiting to land on one side or the other. She made a decision in the space of about 2 heartbeats. "One of the catering staff switched the reserve wine bottles," she said. "I moved them to the service pantry. I told Dana from the catering team there was a label mix-up." Something changed in his face. Very slightly. The kind of change that would have been invisible if she hadn't been watching for it. "When was that?" "Around 9:50. "Which bottles?" "The ones with your personal service marker on the neck. The 2018 reserve, both bottles. They're still on the top shelf in the service pantry behind the napkin ring supply box." He looked at her for a long moment. Not threatening, just thorough. "Anything else?" She thought about the alcove. She thought about Sienna's smile. She thought about the notation folded in her pocket and the clip on her phone's encrypted backup and the 2 wall panels that had been disturbed and the bureau moved 6 inches from the wall. "Not that I can confirm," she said. It was technically true. She could confirm the wine bottles because she'd handled them. Everything else was observation without documentation, the kind of thing that dissolved in a lawyer's hands. He nodded once. He left the room. She went back to scrubbing the champagne from the floor, and her hands were completely steady, which surprised her a little, because her heart was doing something complicated behind her sternum that had nothing to do with calm. But she found Dante's brother at noon. Not found in the sense of discovery. She knew Nico Marcel existed, had seen him twice in 3 years, knew he was 4 years younger than Dante, and occupied a different layer of the family structure, one that she'd always understood to be operational rather than managerial. What she didn't know was that he was in the penthouse today, and specifically that he was in the 3rd guest suite, sitting on the floor with his back against the bed frame and a drink in his hand that he'd clearly poured a while ago and not finished. She opened the door with her keycard because the suite was on her cleaning list and there was no occupied marker on the handle. She stopped in the doorway. Nico looked up at her. He was maybe 29, with a face that looked like a rougher draft of Dante's. The same bone structure, less composed. He had a bruise developing under his left eye that was new since whatever had happened to put it there. "Come to clean," he said. His voice was doing the thing voices did when someone was holding themselves together with a reasonable amount of effort. "I can come back." "No." He used the bed frame to push himself up off the floor. He was wearing the same clothes from the party. "Do the room. I need to—" He stopped, looked at the drink in his hand, set it on the nightstand with a carefulness that was its own kind of statement. "I need to go find my brother." He moved toward the door. He stopped next to her in the doorway because the doorway was not quite wide enough for two people to stand in without being close. "You're Mara," he said. "Yes?" "Dante says you have good eyes." She didn't know what to do with that, so she didn't do anything with it. "The thing with the wine," he said. "Last night. That was you. I moved some bottles." "You moved some bottles." He said it the way you repeat something when you're deciding whether to accept the understatement or push past it. He looked at her for a moment with eyes that were more alert than the rest of his presentation suggested. "Okay," he said, and walked out. She cleaned the room. She found, under the edge of the nightstand where it had likely fallen from a jacket pocket, a small earpiece, the compact wireless kind that security teams used. She looked at it. She put it in her own pocket. She finished cleaning the room. She tried to resign at 2:00. She went to Carver's office, a narrow room near the service elevator that was more filing cabinet than room, and she stood in the doorway and told him she needed to give her notice, effective as soon as he could arrange a replacement. Carver stopped clicking his pen. That alone told her how unusual the moment was. "That's not possible right now," he said. "It's 2 weeks' notice. That's standard. I mean, it's not possible right now in this specific moment, Ms. Voss, because Mr. Marcel has specifically requested that the full household staff remain available through the rehearsal dinner on Thursday." He started clicking the pen again. "After that, you can discuss it with me. Not before." Carver. "Not before Thursday." The pen clicked 3 more times, a period at the end of a sentence he considered closed. She went back to her floor. She thought about just leaving, gathering her things from the locker, walking to the elevator, going home. Nobody could physically stop her. The worst professional consequence was a broken contract, which was an inconvenience, not a catastrophe. She had savings. She had options. She could be on a train to her mother's apartment in Yonkers by 4 in the afternoon, and this entire thing, the ledger, the clean hands, the alcove conversation, the smile, could become a thing she'd once known and carefully forgot. She thought about this with real seriousness, standing in the service corridor with her back against the wall and the earpiece from Nico's room in her pocket and her list folded against her chest. Then she thought about Monday, about whatever was supposed to be done by Monday, about the third column, about the ring on Sienna Vale's finger that was tied to a family trust she'd heard referenced in this building more than once, without ever being told explicitly what it meant. She wasn't going to Yonkers. She hated knowing that about herself. But she knew it. Would. Monday started, and by 9 in the morning, she understood that the shape of things was accelerating faster than she'd calculated. Dante had meetings. She knew this because the penthouse had a different quality of occupied when he was in his private office versus the controlled vacancy it held when he was absent. And today the occupied quality was dense, almost pressurized. A series of men arriving through the main entrance in pairs and leaving 40 minutes to an hour later with expressions that were either tightly neutral or carefully relaxed in the specific way of people who had just been told something they needed to spend the rest of the day not visibly thinking about. She worked around it, cleaned what needed cleaning, received a delivery of additional linens for the rehearsal dinner setup, avoided Sienna, who was in the salon for most of the morning with Petra, the assistant with the blocked number, going through what appeared to be a seating chart that neither of them was happy with. At 11, she went to retrieve the wine bottles from the service pantry. They were gone. She stood in front of the empty high shelf behind the napkin ring supply box and absorbed this with the flatness that had become her primary mode of absorbing unwelcome information. The shelf was clean, Not just empty, but clean. Someone had wiped it recently, within the last few hours, because there was still a slight dampness at the back edge that wasn't consistent with the dry air of the pantry. She checked the pantry log, which was a clipboard on a hook inside the door, where deliveries and removals were supposed to be noted. Nothing logged for the high shelf. She went to find Dana from the catering team and was told by one of the catering assistants that Dana had been let go this morning. Her contract had been ended early, no specific reason given. Mara said thank you. She went back to the service corridor. She stood very still for a moment. Then she pulled out her phone and confirmed for the second time that the security footage clip was still in her encrypted backup. It was. She added a note to her list. Bottles removed. Dana terminated. High shelf wiped. She put the list away. She started thinking about Thursday. The rehearsal dinner's arrival brought a cold front that dropped the city temperature 15 degrees in 12 hours. And by Wednesday afternoon, the windows of the penthouse were gray with the kind of sky that looked like it was considering all its options. Mara had been running on 5 hours of sleep per night for the past 4 days, which was not unusual for this job during an event cycle, but which had a specific quality this week of being 5 hours of sleep next to a problem she couldn't put down and couldn't solve. She'd spent those nights going over what she had, the footage clip, the notation about the alcove, the ledger she'd seen but not read, the earpiece from Nico's room, which she'd examined and identified as the kind used by professional surveillance operatives rather than standard residential security, a distinction she understood because she'd spent an afternoon 3 years ago researching exactly that kind of hardware after finding a different but related piece of equipment in a place it shouldn't have been, which was a whole other story she kept very carefully behind her teeth. What she had was enough to tell a story. What she didn't have was enough to tell it to anyone without becoming the story herself. That was the problem. That was always the problem. The ledger with SV in the columns, the wine she'd moved, the footage of the man with the clean hands, all of it pointed somewhere, but she was a housekeeper, and housekeepers who came forward with stories about crime heirs and conspiracy and suspicious florists ended up in one of two places, and neither of them was good. She was still sitting with that on Wednesday evening when Nico Marcel found her in the kitchen. Not found like the guest suite, found deliberately, the way someone finds you when they know where you are because they looked. "I need to talk to you," he said. The kitchen was empty except for them. It was 8 in the evening. She was eating a bowl of rice and some leftover vegetables because she'd forgotten to eat lunch, and her blood sugar was doing something unpleasant. "Okay," she said. He sat down across from her at the staff table without being invited, which was interesting because in her experience the Marcel family did not sit at staff tables. He looked less wrecked than Sunday. The bruise under his eye had turned yellow at the edges, healing. He was wearing a gray jacket, and he had the look of someone who had made a decision and was now in the stage of executing it, which in her experience was either a relief or a problem depending on what the decision was. "Someone inside this building has been feeding information to the Valentini family for at least 6 months," he said. "We think it started before the engagement was announced." She kept eating. It was deliberate, the eating, because putting the fork down would tell him something about her reaction, and she wasn't ready to give him anything yet. "You're telling me this because Dante thinks you see things." He put both hands flat on the table. They were not clean-handed hands. They had a scar across the right knuckle that looked like it had been badly reset after a break. "And because I've watched the security footage from the florist delivery on Thursday." She put the fork down. "Okay." There it was. "You saw something," he said. "You went back around through the service panel and you looked at the arrangement and you didn't touch it and you didn't report it and you didn't run." He looked at her steadily. "Why didn't you run?" "I thought about it. But you didn't." "No." He was quiet for a moment. Outside the kitchen window, the city was doing its constant low-level noise, traffic and air systems, and the distant suggestion of humanity at scale. And in the kitchen it was very quiet, and the fluorescent light over the counter was doing its faint 60-cycle hum, and the bowl of rice in front of her was getting cold. "The Valentini family," Nico said, "is trying to access a trust held under the Marcel name, a 9-figure offshore trust established by our father. The only access point is a family instrument. The ring," she said. He stopped. He looked at her. "The ring Sienna is wearing," she said. "The one that arrived Tuesday. It's tied to the trust somehow." He didn't confirm it. He didn't need to. His face did the confirming without his permission. "SV," she said. "In the ledger." And then she stopped, because she'd said more than she'd meant to, and she saw him processing the fact that she'd seen the ledger, and she watched him make the calculation she'd been afraid of. Who is this person, and what does she know, and how long has she known it? "You saw the ledger," he said slowly. "It was on the desk. It was open." "When?" "Friday afternoon. I was collecting coffee cups." He breathed out through his nose. It was not a comfortable sound. "Mara." He said her name for the first time, and it had the specific weight of someone who was deciding whether to trust you and hadn't entirely decided yet. "The ledger is gone. It was taken during the party Saturday night. We have been—" He stopped, restarted. "We've been looking for it since Sunday morning." She took out her phone. She found the encrypted backup. She turned the screen toward him and let him watch the footage clip from the study camera. 23 seconds, start to finish, the clean-handed man, the quick hands, the small device photographing the pages. Nico watched it twice. His face did something complicated and then went very still. "You saved this," he said. "Yes." "Why?" She thought about the honest answer, which was that she had been watching and calculating and noting things for 3 years, not entirely by accident and not entirely out of professional diligence, and that there was a version of why she was in this building at all that she had never told anyone and was not going to tell him now. So she gave him the second most honest answer. "Because I didn't know what it meant yet," she said. "But I knew it meant something." He looked at her for a long time, long enough that she could see him making the decision. "Thursday," he said, "the rehearsal dinner. Something is going to happen Thursday." "I know." "How do you know?" "Someone said by Monday it's done. It's already past Monday and it's not done, which means the timeline slipped. Thursday is the next fixed point." He looked at her like she'd said something in a language he hadn't expected her to speak. "You heard that. On Saturday. Alcove off the secondary hallway, around 11:40. "Who?" "Sienna," she said, "and a man I didn't recognize." The kitchen was very quiet for about 4 seconds. "Okay," Nico said. He stood up. He had the particular quality of motion that people had when they were moving toward a decision they'd been delaying and had just stopped delaying. "I need to talk to Dante." "I know." "You should—" He stopped. He looked at her with something that might, from certain angles, have been concern. "You should be careful, Mara, from here forward." "I've been careful. More careful," he said. "Than that." He left the kitchen. She sat with her cold rice for another minute, and then she cleared the table and washed the bowl and put it away, because the habits held even when everything else was moving fast. And she went back upstairs to finish the nightly turndown and tell herself she had until Thursday to figure out what she was going to do. She had until Thursday. That was what she told herself. What she didn't know was that Sienna Vale had been in the hallway outside the kitchen for the last 4 minutes of that conversation, standing in the dark with her champagne flat in her glass and her smile entirely gone, listening to every word. And that by Thursday morning, Mara Voss would be standing in front of the entire assembled rehearsal dinner party, staff, guests, family, accused of stealing the Marcel ring from Sienna's own dressing table, with no way to prove she hadn't. They came for her at 7:15 Thursday morning. Not Carver, not Nico. 2 men she didn't recognize, which was itself the first wrong thing, because Mara knew every member of Dante's security rotation by face, if not by name, and these 2 were not part of any rotation she'd observed. They were big in the specific way of men who were paid to be big, and they arrived at the staff entrance on the 42nd floor with the particular efficiency of people who already knew exactly where she'd be and at what time, which meant someone had given them her schedule. She was at her cart in the service corridor, preparing for the morning round, when they appeared at the end of the hall. She saw them before they announced themselves, which gave her approximately 4 seconds of processing time, and she used those 4 seconds to note the exits and calculate the distance to each, and arrive at the conclusion that neither option was going to help her. "Ms. Voss," The taller one. His voice had the texture of something rehearsed. "Yes," she said. "Mr. Marcel needs to see you upstairs." She put down the cleaning supplies she was holding. She did it slowly and deliberately, so her hands were visible and empty, because she had enough situational intelligence to know that in moments like this, visible and empty hands were a form of communication. "Which Mr. Marcel?" she said. A pause. "Dante Marcel." She nodded. She followed them to the elevator. The ride up was 40 seconds of silence in a small metal box, and she spent those 40 seconds doing the thing she always did in high-pressure moments, which was to inventory what she had on her person. Her phone in her left jacket pocket, list folded inside it. The earpiece from Nico's room in her right jacket pocket, where it had lived for 4 days because she hadn't known what to do with it and hadn't wanted to leave it somewhere it could be found. Her key card. Her own keys, apartment and mailbox. Nothing else. The elevator opened into the penthouse's private foyer, and she stepped out and understood immediately that the quality of the air in this building had changed overnight. She could feel it before she saw it. The specific atmospheric pressure of a crisis that had been contained but not resolved, like the moment after a glass breaks, and before anyone moves to clean it up. 3 of Dante's men were visible from where she stood, positioned in the angles of the main salon entrance, with the particular stillness of people who had been given a specific instruction and were executing it. And in the center of the salon, standing with the kind of composure that took real effort to maintain, was Dante. He was in a dark jacket, no tie, which she recognized as his functional mode, the way he dressed when the day was going to require something of him. He had a phone in one hand held at his side, and his other hand was in his jacket pocket, and he was looking at her with an expression that she had not seen on his face in 3 years and 4 months of working in proximity to him. It was not anger. It was something colder than anger. The kind of expression that preceded a decision that had already been made. "Sit down," he said. She sat. The chair across from him was one of the salon's formal pieces, rigid-backed, positioned in a way that was not accidental. It faced the room, and the room faced her. She understood the geometry of the moment, and she sat in it and kept her hand still in her lap. "The ring is missing," he said. She looked at him. "Okay." Sienna's ring, the Marcel family instrument. It was in her dressing room last night at 10:50 when she confirmed it to me. This morning at 6:40, it was gone. "I understand." The dressing room was accessed between 11 and 6:30 by 2 keycard entries. He paused. One was Sienna's own card at 11:03 when she retired. The second was your key card at 2:17 in the morning. The salon was very quiet. Mara felt something happen in her chest that was not quite shock and not quite the absence of shock, but something in the precise geographic center of the two, a kind of cold settling, like water finding its level in a tilted container. Because she understood immediately, with complete clarity, what had happened. Not what she'd done, she knew what she hadn't done. But what had been done to her, and how long it had been in preparation, and how clean it was. Her keycard. She thought about the 800 times she'd set her keycard down on the staff locker bench while she changed uniforms. She thought about the 30 or 40 times she'd left her jacket hanging in the service corridor while she handled something that required both hands. She thought about 3 years and 4 months of being invisible enough that nobody watched where she put things, because nobody thought she was worth watching. "I didn't go to the dressing room at 2:17, she said. "Your card did." "My card was copied." Something moved across his face. Not disbelief, not belief, just the movement of a man processing a variable he hadn't weighted sufficiently. "That's what you're saying," he said. "That's what happened." "Mara." He said her name the way Nico had said it, with weight behind it, but different weight. More complicated weight. "I need to know if you took that ring." "I didn't." "I need more than, I know what you need," she said, and her voice was steady, which surprised her a little. "And I know I can't give it to you in the next 30 seconds, but I need you to tell me who else is in this room right now." He looked at her. The pause stretched. "Tell me if Sienna is here," she said. "Tell me if she's going to walk through that door." The pause stretched another 2 seconds, and then she heard the sound of heels on the marble floor of the connecting hallway, and Sienna Vale walked into the salon with Petra 2 steps behind her and the particular composure of a woman who had been waiting for exactly this moment and had dressed for it accordingly. She was in white. The timing of the color choice was not lost on Mara. Checked it. What happened in the next 8 minutes was the kind of thing that Mara would replay in fragments for a long time afterward, not because it was the worst thing she'd ever experienced, but because of how surgical it was, how carefully it had been constructed, how long in advance someone had been building it. Sienna walked into the room and looked at Mara the way you look at something that has confirmed your worst opinion of itself. "I want her removed from this building," she said. Not to Mara, to Dante, as if Mara was already furniture again, or less than furniture, already a resolved issue. "That's not your decision," Dante said. Something moved through Sienna's eyes, very fast. "Excuse me." "Sit down, Sienna." She sat. Slowly, with the deliberate quality of someone who was choosing to comply rather than being compelled to, a distinction she clearly felt was important to establish. "Tell me what you told me this morning," Dante said. "From the beginning." Sienna looked at Mara. The smile was gone. The one from Saturday night, the one that had known something. In its place was an expression that Mara had only seen on a few faces in her life, and each time it had told her the same thing. This person is performing a truth rather than telling one. "I retired to my dressing room at 11, Sienna said. "I confirmed the ring was in its case on the vanity. I locked the room. At 6:40 this morning, I found the case open and the ring gone." She paused. "The security log shows Mara's keycard entered the room at 2:17. "That's correct," Dante said. "And you have nothing else to add?" "What else would there be?" She turned her hands up, palms open. A gesture of guilelessness so precisely deployed it had probably been practiced. "I've been nothing but considerate to this woman. I don't enjoy this." Mara looked at Sienna's hands. The ring was not on her finger. It had not been on her finger when she'd walked in, which was the first thing Mara had checked, because it was the detail that mattered most, and details that mattered most were the ones you looked at first. "Where were you Wednesday night?" Mara said. Everyone looked at her. Sienna's expression didn't change exactly, but something behind it shifted, a small recalibration. "I beg your pardon." "It's a simple question," Mara said. "Where were you Wednesday night between 11 and 6:30? "In my suite, asleep." "Alone." "That's inappropriate." "Is Petra your alibi, or isn't she?" Mara looked at Petra briefly. Petra had the expression of someone who had been handed a script and was discovering some of the pages were missing. "Because if Petra confirms you were in your suite all night, then we have one story. And if Petra can't confirm that, then we have a different story." The room had gone very still. Dante was watching this with an expression she couldn't fully read, but he was not stopping it, and the fact that he was not stopping it told her something. Sienna turned to Dante. "I'm not going to be questioned by your help." "My help," he said quietly, "just raised a point I should have raised." Another movement behind Sienna's eyes, faster this time, more opaque. "This is absurd," she said. "The keycard log can be falsified," Dante said, "or the card can be copied. You're defending her." "I'm being methodical." "Dante." She leaned forward slightly. She had a way of deploying her own beauty as a kind of argument, a thing she'd probably been doing since she was 17 and discovered it worked, and she was doing it now. The slight angle of her jaw, the particular quality of her attention. "She's been in this building for 3 years. She has access to everything. She knows where everything is. If someone was going to... She also," Dante said, "moved the wine bottles on Saturday night." Silence. "What wine bottles?" Sienna said. Her voice was perfectly flat. "The reserve bottles with the personal service marker. Someone switched them into the general pool. Mara moved them back. The 2 bottles are still in the service pantry." He paused. "I had them tested this morning. Both of them had been adulterated." The word landed in the room like a stone in still water, and the ripples went out in all directions, and Mara watched Sienna's face absorb the impact of it and do something she was clearly not prepared for, which was to show, for just under a second, the actual geometry of her reaction. It was not surprise. It was the expression of someone who has just discovered that a variable they thought they'd controlled had not been controlled. It lasted less than a second. Then the composure came back up, like a curtain, and Sienna straightened in her chair and looked at Dante with a new configuration of her expression, something more careful, more measured. "I don't know what that means," she said. "Yes, you do," he said. Chat. The next hour was the worst hour. Not because of what happened in the salon. Sienna excused herself with the particular dignity of someone retreating to regroup rather than withdrawing from defeat. And Petra followed her, and the men Mara didn't recognize were sent to positions she couldn't see. And Dante made a phone call that lasted 4 minutes and consisted almost entirely of him listening. But because of what happened immediately after, which was that 3 more people arrived in the penthouse, and among them was a woman Mara had never seen before who introduced herself as Elena Voss, not Mara's mother. The name was a coincidence, and coincidences were another thing Mara had learned to be careful about treating as neutral. Elena Voss was perhaps 60, with the bearing of someone who had spent decades making decisions in rooms where most people weren't allowed to sit. She arrived with 2 men who said nothing and stood near the main entrance with the stillness of people paid to stand still and do it professionally. She looked at Mara once, briefly, with the kind of assessment that didn't waste effort on being subtle about being an assessment. Then she went with Dante into the private office, and the door closed. Mara sat in the salon. One of the original security men, one of the rotation she recognized, was near the window. He didn't look at her. She didn't look at him. They both existed in the same room with the practiced non-acknowledgement of 2 people who understood their roles in this particular moment. 23 minutes passed. The door opened. Dante came out alone. He walked to where she was sitting and stood in front of her, and she looked up at him. "Tell me everything," he said. "From the beginning, the florist, the wine, what you heard in the alcove, the ledger, all of it." She looked at him for a moment. She thought about the 3 years of keeping things behind her teeth, the discipline of it, the specific weight of what she'd carried by herself and why. Then she told him. All of it. Not the part she'd been protecting by omission, not the edited version she'd given Nico in the kitchen. The full accounting, in order, with the specific details she'd noted, and the specific logic she'd applied, and the conclusions she'd drawn, and the actions she'd taken, and the ones she'd deliberately not taken. She told him about the earpiece in her pocket. She took it out and put it on the table between them. He looked at it. He looked at her. She told him about the footage clip. She took out her phone and showed him. He watched it twice without speaking. She told him about SV and the ledger columns. She told him about the alcove. By Monday it's done, she's mine. And she told him the timestamp and the voices and the exact words in the exact order she'd heard them, because she had the kind of memory that was less a gift than a compulsion, a brain that photographed things she didn't always choose to photograph. When she was done, Dante was very quiet. "Why didn't you come to me on Saturday night?" he said. Not accusatory, something more complicated than accusatory. "I had observations, not evidence." "You had the clip." "I had a clip of a man with clean hands I couldn't name, in a building where you trust people I've never been introduced to. I had a ledger entry I'd seen for 3 seconds from 4 feet away. I had a conversation through a wall I couldn't fully attribute." She met his eyes. "If I came to you Saturday night with that, and said your fiancé is working against you, what happens to me?" The silence lasted longer this time. "I understand," he said quietly. "I needed more before I could be believed. I was trying to get more." She paused. "I ran out of time." He stood up. He went to the window. He stood with his back to her and looked at the city for a moment. And she watched his shoulders and read the tension in them, the way she'd learned to read the tension in spaces that people thought were private. "The ring," he said. "I need to know where the ring is." "I don't have it." "I know that." He turned back. "But someone in this building does. And the rehearsal dinner is in 4 hours, and the Valentini family's representatives are expected to be in attendance, and if the ring doesn't appear—" He stopped. "If it doesn't appear, the trust goes into a contested state, which is exactly what they want." She understood the shape of it now, the full shape. the way a map becomes legible when you finally have all the landmarks. The ring wasn't just a symbol. It was a legal instrument. Its disappearance wasn't theft. It was a move in a larger game, one designed to destabilize the Marcel Trust and create an opening for the Valentini family to exploit through whatever mechanism they'd been engineering through Sienna's access to the family's inner circle. "Sienna has it," Mara said. "We can't prove that." "Then we find proof." He looked at her. "How?" She thought for a moment. She thought about the 3 years of this building, the floor plans she'd memorized, the habits of every person she'd observed, the specific way Sienna moved through space, the routes she preferred, the rooms she treated as private versus performative. "The suite she's using," Mara said, "the east-facing suite on the upper floor. She spends most of her morning there. Petra comes and goes, but Sienna stays. She doesn't let the cleaning staff in while she's present. She's made that request formally through Carver 3 times. She paused. "Which means she has something in that room she doesn't want touched." Dante looked at her steadily. "I can't go into her suite without—" "You don't need to," Mara said. "I clean this building. I have operational access to every room. If I have a maintenance reason—" "Mara." He said her name with a quality she hadn't heard from him before, something that wasn't quite warning and wasn't quite concern. "If she sees you go in there, she'll use it against me," Mara said. "Yes, I know." She held his gaze. "But she's already using everything she has against me. The keycard entry was planted. The accusation this morning was not improvised. She's been building this for longer than Saturday night." She paused. "So the question isn't whether she comes after me. She already has. The question is whether I do something useful before she finishes." The room was very quiet. Dante's expression was doing something she couldn't entirely catalog, something that crossed between calculation and something more private, more unresolved, and she didn't look away from it because looking away felt like it would cost her something she couldn't afford to lose right now. "If you go in that room," he said slowly, "and she's set a trap, then I'll be standing in it," Mara said. "I'm already standing in one. Look." She went in at 12:40, during the 40-minute window between Sienna's departure to the stylist chair in the main dressing suite and her expected return, which Mara had calculated based on the schedule Petra had shared with Carver's office on Tuesday for the day's event preparations. 40 minutes was not much time. 40 minutes was all she had. The East Suite's card reader accepted her key card. The door opened. She stepped in and let it close behind her and stood for 3 seconds doing nothing but looking. The room was ordered in the specific way of someone who was naturally meticulous but was also, currently, managing a great deal. The visible surfaces were controlled, the vanity, the side table, the chair near the window, but there was a quality to the arrangement that Mara recognized from 100 other occupied spaces she'd cleaned. The things on the surfaces were placed, not settled. They were a presentation. They were what you saw when what mattered was somewhere else. She started with the logical hiding spaces. Not obvious ones. She wasn't looking under the mattress, but the spaces that a person of Sienna's habits would use. The interior lining of a garment bag in the closet. The pocket of a cosmetics case large enough to hold something the size of a ring box. The underside of a jewelry tray on the upper closet shelf. 8 minutes in, she found something that stopped her cold. Not the ring. Not yet. In the interior pocket of the second garment bag, a long one, holding an evening dress in a dry cleaning sleeve, was a phone. Not Sienna's regular phone, which Mara had seen Sienna handle 100 times, a sleek thing in a rose gold case. This was a secondary phone, older model, prepaid, with a case that was plain and dark and deliberately unremarkable. She picked it up. The screen was locked, but it wasn't dark. It had been used recently enough that the screen hadn't timed out fully, and when she touched it to check, it came back up to the last screen. A messaging app, and on the messaging app, the last sent message, time-stamped at 11:48 the previous night. She read it in 4 seconds. She read it twice more to be certain. The message said, "Keycard used 217, logged and confirmed. She'll be standing in it by morning. After dinner tonight, move on N. She thought about that letter the way she'd thought about SV in the ledger columns. And then the specific cold clarity of it dropped into her chest like a weight. N. Nico. She stood in Sienna's East Suite with a prepaid phone in her hand, and the realization cascading through her that the rehearsal dinner tonight was not just a social event. It was a timeline. Move on N. After dinner, after the guests were assembled, after the attention of every person in the building was organized around the formal proceedings of an engagement celebration and the chaos of a stolen ring and a disgraced housekeeper. After all of that, someone was going to move on Nico Marcel. She was still processing the full weight of that when she heard the handle of the suite door move. She put the phone back exactly as she'd found it. She stepped away from the garment bag. She was 6 feet from the closet and moving toward the window when the door opened and Petra walked in and stopped completely still in the doorway and looked at her. The two of them stood there for a beat that lasted far longer than a beat. Petra's face went through several things in fast succession: surprise, calculation, and then something that settled into a careful blankness that told Mara everything she needed to know about whether Petra was an innocent bystander in any of this. "What are you doing in here?" Petra said. Mara held up the cleaning cloth she'd brought. "Water damage reported on the window seal. Maintenance request through Carver's office." It was a reasonable lie. A complete lie, but reasonable. Petra looked at the window. She looked at Mara. She looked at the closet, which was closed, which it had been when Mara entered, which meant if Petra had any reason to check the garment bag, she would need to open it first, and Mara had not left anything visibly disturbed. "Get out," Petra said. "Of course." Mara moved toward the door with the pace of someone who had completed a task and was leaving. Not fast, not slow. She was in the hallway with the door closed behind her when she heard Petra's voice from inside the room, muffled through the door. On the phone. Not the regular one. She didn't stop to listen. She moved down the hallway toward the service corridor, and her mind was running faster than her feet, and the cold weight in her chest had not lifted, and she was calculating the time. 3 hours until the rehearsal dinner, 3 hours to figure out how to tell Dante that the woman he was about to stand beside in front of his family and his enemies had never been after the trust. Not primarily, not ultimately. She'd been after Nico. The trust was the distraction. The ring was the mechanism. And tonight, while the room was full and the chaos was centered on Mara and the stolen ring and the contaminated wine, someone was going to make a move against the one member of the Marcel family who operated rather than managed, the one who could actually stop them if he saw it coming. She needed to find Dante. Right now. Not through channels, not through Carver, not through the careful professional distance she'd maintained for 3 years. She needed to find him directly, and she needed him to listen, and she needed him to believe her in the time remaining, which was less time than she would have chosen for the task of asking a man to trust a housekeeper over the woman he was going to marry. She was at the service corridor junction when she stopped walking because Dante was already there. Standing in the narrow corridor with his jacket on and his phone at his side, and the look on his face of a man who had just received news from a direction he hadn't expected. "Nico's not answering," he said. The cold thing in her chest got colder. "He's been unreachable since 11 this morning," Dante said. His voice was controlled, but the control was taking effort, visible effort, the kind she'd never seen from him before. "His phone goes to voicemail. His detail—" He stopped. Started again. "His detail reported in at 10:50 and has not checked in since." Mara looked at him. "It's not about the ring," she said. "I know. They're moving on Nico tonight." "I know," he said again, and then, "I need to know where, and I need to know now." She thought about the prepaid phone. She thought about the message. After dinner tonight, move on N. She thought about what she knew about this building. Not just the floor plan, but the pressure points of it, the corridors and service routes, and the specific places where a person could be moved through a building without being seen. She'd spent 3 years cataloging those places. She'd spent 3 years building exactly the kind of knowledge that was useless in an ordinary life, and essential in a moment exactly like this one. "I know where they'll bring him," she said. And somewhere in the building below them, in a room Mara was 90% certain she could name, the rehearsal dinner was being set, and the candles were being lit, and the guests were beginning to arrive. And Nico Marcel— "Where?" Dante said. Not a question. A demand compressed into a single word, the kind that didn't have room for anything except the answer. "The wine cellar," Mara said. Sub-basement level. The old one, not the operational one. It's been off the rotation for 2 years. Carver decommissioned it when the new climate-controlled unit was installed on 41. It's not on any current maintenance list, which means the cameras down there haven't been checked in. How do you know about it? Because I found a humidity leak 18 months ago that was coming up through the floor seam in the service corridor. I traced it down, filed a report. Carver closed it without action because the space was already decommissioned. She held his eyes. Nobody goes down there. Nobody has a reason to. Dante looked at her for 2 full seconds. Then he turned and spoke to someone she couldn't see around the corner of the service junction. 2 words, low and hard, and she heard movement begin. "Stay here," he said to her. "No." He turned back. The look on his face was the one she'd been waiting to see. Not anger, not dismissal, but the particular friction of a man recalculating something mid-stride and not having time to recalculate it fully. "Mara, you don't know the route," she said. "There are 3 sub-basement corridors, and one of them dead ends behind the old generator housing, and one of them floods at the south end when the pressure is high. The one you want is the east branch. I know exactly where it is, and you don't." Another 2 seconds. "Then stay behind me," he said. She followed him. There were 4 of them moving through the building. Dante, Mara, and 2 of his men whose names she didn't know, but whose competence was visible in the way they moved, fluid and angled, keeping positions that didn't require communication to maintain. They took the service elevator to the basement level and then the stairs from there, the ones that weren't on the main blueprint because they'd been added during a structural modification in the building's 2nd decade and had never been formally integrated into the public-facing documentation. Mara knew about them because she knew about the East Branch. She knew about the East Branch because she knew about the humidity leak. The chain of knowledge ran backward through 18 months of this building's habits, the way all her knowledge ran. Accumulated through proximity, through patience, through being precisely the kind of person nobody thought was collecting anything. The sub-basement was cold. Not the managed cold of a climate-controlled space, but the ambient cold of a place that had been left to find its own temperature, which was several degrees below the floors above. The light was emergency level, a strip of yellow along the base of the east wall that activated on motion and gave everything the color of old photographs. Mara moved in front. She didn't ask permission, she just did it, stepping ahead of Dante's lead position and taking the first junction left and then immediately right, past the dead generator housing, which was the size of a small car and smelled of old oil and rust, and then along the corridor that narrowed to barely shoulder width before opening again into the space that had once been the wine cellar. She stopped. She held up one hand. Dante and his men stopped. She could hear something ahead. Not voices. Not yet. A sound with the specific quality of a person trying to control their breathing and not entirely succeeding. The small, irregular catch of someone doing the math of their own situation and not liking the answer. Nico. She turned to look at Dante. She didn't speak. Neither did he. He looked at his men, and something passed between them in the grammar of people who had done this before, and they moved. What happened in the next 90 seconds had the compressed quality of things that happen too fast for the brain to process in real time, and that only become fully legible afterward in the reconstruction. She stayed at the junction corner, pressed against the wall, and heard the door to the wine cellar space go in hard, and heard voices spike. Not Nico's voice, other voices, 2 of them, both in the register of men surprised while doing something that required surprise to work against them. And then a sound that was physical, the specific percussion of a body meeting a surface at speed, and then something that might have been a gun hitting the floor, and then a stretch of hard grunting effort. Then Dante's voice, very flat. "Put it down." Silence. "Put it down and step back." More silence, a different quality of silence, the kind that meant compliance. She came around the corner. The wine cellar space was maybe 30 feet deep and 20 wide, with old empty racking along 3 walls and a concrete floor that still had the ring-shaped stains of bottle storage. The yellow emergency light was dimmer here, supplemented by a portable LED work lamp someone had brought in and placed on the floor, which gave the whole scene an upward cast quality that made everyone look like they were in a bad dream. Nico was zip-tied to a chair in the center of the room. His face was worse than Wednesday. The yellow bruise under his eye had a new companion, a cut above his left eyebrow that had bled and dried and bled again, and there was a specific quality to the way he was sitting that told her his ribs were either bruised or broken. He was conscious. His eyes found her when she came in, and something in them shifted. Not relief exactly, more like a man recalculating the odds and finding them marginally better than they'd been 60 seconds ago. Dante's men had the two men from the room in hand. She didn't recognize either of them from the building staff or security, which confirmed what she'd already understood. They were external, brought in specifically for tonight, for this. Dante was cutting the zip ties with a knife that had appeared from somewhere she hadn't seen. "Can you stand?" he said to Nico. "Yeah." Nico stood up. He didn't do it easily. He put one hand on the chair arm and pushed and got there, and once he was upright, he stood for a moment with his jaw set and his breathing deliberate, the specific effort of someone telling their body to function. "How long?" "It's 3:10, Mara said. Nico looked at her. "The dinner starts at 6. "Yes. They need the ring back in the room before 6, or the trust window." "I know," Dante said. "Do you have it?" "No." A beat. "Sienna," Nico said. "Yes." Nico looked at his brother with the look of a man who wanted to say something and had decided this was not the time and the place for it, and what he said instead was, "Tell me what we have." They got Nico upstairs through the service route. Mara went first, Dante and Nico behind her, the two security men bringing the rear with the two men from the cellar restrained and silent. She moved faster than she would have on a normal day, and her legs knew the route without her having to think about it, which was the only advantage she had over the fact that her heart was running at a rate that wasn't comfortable, and the cold from the sub-basement had gotten into her hands, and she couldn't entirely feel her fingertips. In the 42nd floor office, the narrow room adjacent to the service elevator that was usually Carver's domain, currently empty because Carver was upstairs managing rehearsal dinner logistics, she spread out what they had. Dante laid it out in sequence: the adulterated wine bottles, the ledger, the footage clip from the study camera, the prepaid phone in Sienna's garment bag, and the message on it: "After dinner tonight, move on in," the keycard entry planted in the security log. Nico listened to all of it standing up, which she understood was partly because sitting hurt. "The ring is the instrument," he said when Dante finished. "Without it, the trust is in contest. They needed it out of Sienna's possession before the ceremony, so it couldn't be formally transferred. The framing," he looked at Mara, "framing you was a way to put the accusation inside the house so it looked like an inside job and not an external move. Cleaner, harder to trace back to the Valentinis. They also needed me out of the building," Mara said. "If I got removed for theft, everything I'd seen goes with me, or gets discredited. And you had the footage clip," Nico said, "which they didn't know about." "Does Sienna know you went in her room today?" "Petra saw me leave," Mara said. "She called someone on the prepaid phone immediately after." "So they know you might have seen the message?" "Yes." Nico turned to Dante. "They'll move faster now. They won't wait for after dinner." Dante's jaw was doing something. She'd seen it before, this specific tension, but not at this magnitude. Not the controlled pressure of a man managing a negotiation, but the different and more dangerous pressure of a man who had just realized the scope of a betrayal he'd been living inside of. "Where's Sienna now?" he said. One of his men answered from near the door. "Last confirmed location was the main dressing suite 40 minutes ago. Stylist appointment." "Find her." The man left. The room was quiet for a moment with the specific quality of a pause before something irrevocable. "Dante," Nico said, "don't. I'm not going to say I told you. I'm going to say we need to decide what we're doing in the next 2 hours before the Valentini representatives arrive. And the whole thing becomes a public event with an audience." Dante looked at his brother. Something passed between them that Mara didn't try to read because it was private in a way she recognized, and she looked at the floor instead. "We need the ring," Dante said. "We need more than the ring," Nico said. "We need to be able to put everything in front of the room tonight. All of it. The footage, the message, the wine. If we can do it in front of their people, in front of the family." He paused. "It collapses the whole architecture, not just the theft, the alliance, the agreement, all of it." And if we can't locate the ring in time, Nico was quiet for a moment. Then we're in a contested trust state, and the lawyers own the next 2 years. Dante turned to Mara. You searched the East Suite. You didn't find the ring. I found the phone. I didn't have time to complete the search. Where else? She thought. She thought about Sienna's patterns, the route she took, the rooms she preferred, the requests she'd made through Carver over the past 6 weeks, the south balcony access she'd asked for twice for no stated reason, the request to have the main dressing suite restocked with a specific cosmetics brand that required a lockable cabinet, which Carver had sourced and installed and which was currently sitting against the north wall of the main dressing suite with a small padlock on the lower drawer. The dressing suite, Mara said. The lockable cabinet. Carver installed it 6 weeks ago at Sienna's specific request. I've never had access to the lower drawer. Dante looked at one of the remaining men. Get Carver. He's upstairs with the... Get him. Well, Carver arrived in 4 minutes with the expression of a man who had been managing 17 simultaneous logistical threads and had just had one more dropped on him from altitude. He looked at Nico's face and at the general quality of the room and clicked his pen twice, and then, with the professional adaptability of someone who had worked in this building long enough to understand that some situations required less asking and more doing, he produced a small key from his keyring and handed it to Dante without being asked. The cabinet key, he said. Yes, Dante said. I assumed you'd need it eventually. He clicked the pen a third time. The stylist finished 20 minutes ago, by the way. Ms. Vale is in the salon. Which salon? Main. She came down early. She said she wanted to check the table settings. Dante and Nico exchanged a look that lasted less than a second. She knows, Nico said. She's been in position since the stylist finished, Dante said. She's waiting for the Valentini representatives. If the ring is already out of the cabinet, then we're out of time, Dante said. He looked at Mara. I need you in the main dressing suite, right now. If the ring is in that cabinet, you call me. Don't touch anything else. Don't let anyone see you go in. And if Sienna, he said, is going to be occupied. He walked out. Nico, moving with the deliberate care of someone managing pain that wasn't going away, followed him. Carver looked at Mara once with an expression she'd never seen on his face before, something that might have been the topography of concern, and then he went too. She took the key. She went upstairs. The main dressing suite was on the upper floor of the penthouse, east-facing, connected to the master corridor by a short hallway with its own card access. Mara's keycard got her in. She didn't run. Running in this building was the fastest way to become visible, but she moved with a pace that was as close to running as walking could be. The suite was empty. The aftermath of the stylist was visible in the arrangement of tools and product on the vanity surface, the specific scattered order of professional work recently completed. The room smelled of heated hair and something floral. The cabinet was against the north wall, matte black, about the size of a large nightstand, 2 drawers. The upper was unlocked and contained exactly what you'd expect. Additional cosmetics, a travel case, 2 small perfume bottles. The lower had the padlock. She put the key in. It turned. She opened the drawer. The ring was there. Not in its velvet case. Loose, sitting directly on the felt lining of the drawer, and next to it a folded piece of paper. She didn't unfold the paper. She took out her phone and photographed both. The ring in position, the paper folded beside it, the key still in the lock. 3 angles, the way the clean-handed man had photographed the hallway on Thursday morning. Then she called Dante. He picked up on the first ring. Tell me. It's here. East dressing suite, north cabinet, lower drawer. A beat. There's a document with it, she said. I didn't touch it. Don't touch anything. Stay in the room. Dante. She kept her voice flat. Sienna knows I went in the East Suite this afternoon. If she moves now, she won't, he said. She's in the salon with 2 of our family attorneys and the first of the Valentini representatives who arrived 20 minutes early, which means she is currently in a room she cannot leave without it reading exactly as guilty as she is. And the ring. I'm coming up. She stood in the dressing suite with the phone in her hand and the open drawer in front of her and the ring on its felt lining, and she breathed, in and out, slow, because slow was the only speed that worked when everything in her system wanted to go fast. Her hands were still cold from the sub-basement. She pressed them flat against her thighs and felt the fabric of her uniform trousers and focused on that specific texture and breathed. Dante came in 90 seconds later with one of the attorneys she'd seen arrive. A man in his 50s with reading glasses on a chain and the bearing of someone who was paid to be unshakable, and a man she recognized as one of Dante's senior security, a person who had been in this building as long as she had, and who looked at her now with an expression that was not quite surprised and not quite not surprised. The attorney looked at the drawer. He put on a pair of thin latex gloves that materialized from his jacket pocket. He picked up the document and unfolded it. He read it. His face did nothing, but his jaw tightened once at the corner, just barely. "It's a transfer document," he said, "dated for tonight. Executing a transfer of beneficial interest in the offshore trust to an entity registered in the Valentini family's corporate structure." He turned it slightly toward the light. "It would require the ring as physical collateral for notarization. The intent was to have it notarized tonight at the dinner." "By whom?" Dante said. The attorney looked at the signature line at the bottom of the document. "The notary listed is a man I know. He's on the Valentini payroll." He paused. "There's a second signature line, partially completed." He turned the document toward Dante. Dante looked at it. His face was doing something that was not expressible as any single emotion. "Sienna signed it already," the attorney said. "All she needed was the notary and the ring, both of which were scheduled to be in the same room tonight." The room was quiet for a moment that felt very long. "We have everything," the attorney said. "The document, the ring, the footage clip, the message transcript. If presented correctly before the full assembled dinner, in front of the Valentini representatives, it ends the alliance publicly," Dante said. "More than that, it creates grounds for the family to pursue action against the Valentinis directly for the attempted trust fraud. The attorney stopped, chose his words. "The attempted action against Nico." Dante stood in the dressing suite for a moment. He put both hands in his jacket pockets. He looked at the ring in the drawer without touching it. "Nico needs a doctor," he said to the security man. "Already called. ETA 12 minutes. Tell him to come in through the service entrance and go to the 42nd floor office." "Yes, sir." The man left. The attorney was documenting the contents of the drawer with a camera of his own. Dante stood where he was. Mara was by the door. She'd been moving toward it by degrees, the way she moved toward exits when her presence in a situation had resolved to its conclusion, the specific muscle memory of a person who knew when she'd done what she came to do and when staying longer became a different kind of problem. "Mara," Dante said. She stopped. "Don't leave this floor," he said. Not a request. "Not yet." She looked at him. "The dinner is in 2 hours and 40 minutes, and I need you in that room." She held his gaze. "You have everything you need." The attorney. "I have evidence," he said. "I don't have the person who assembled it." He looked at her with the expression she still couldn't fully catalog, the one that had been accumulating across these past 3 days every time their eyes held for longer than professional necessity required. "She set you up to take the fall for all of this. I want you in that room when it falls on her instead." The attorney had the grace to become extremely focused on his documentation. Mara looked at Dante for a moment. She thought about the 3 years of invisibility, the worn shoes, the paper bag comment, Sienna's smile on Saturday night. "She's mine." "Okay," she said. Dasant. The rehearsal dinner was scheduled for 6, but the Valentini representatives had been arriving since 5:20, which told Mara everything about their confidence in the night's intended outcome. They arrived in 2 groups, 4 people total, and they moved through the penthouse with the assurance of people who expected to leave it with something they'd come for. She watched them from the service corridor entrance. One of the sight lines she knew gave her full visibility into the main salon without being visible herself. She'd spent 3 years using these angles. She used them now. Sienna was already in the salon. She was in the white dress, the same one she'd worn this morning for the accusation, which Mara understood was deliberate, a costume choice for a scene she'd planned. She was working the room with her specific social fluency, moving from the Valentini people to the family members, to the attorneys with the grace of a woman who believed she was the center of an inevitable outcome. She did not look toward the service corridor. She didn't know Mara was still in the building. She thought Mara had been removed this morning or was about to be removed, and that confidence was its own vulnerability. At 5:50, Dante walked into the salon. He walked in the way he always walked, unhurried, with that quality of covering ground faster than it appeared. He was in a different jacket than this morning. Black, fitted, the kind of jacket that said the evening was formal and that the person wearing it had decided what the evening was going to be. He was not alone. Nico was behind him. Nico's face had been cleaned up. The cut above his eye had been attended to, and he moved with the controlled care of someone whose ribs had been confirmed as bruised rather than broken, and who had been told this and had decided it was acceptable. Behind Nico came the attorney, and behind the attorney came two more men she didn't recognize but whose positioning told her they were on the right side of the room. The salon felt the shift when Dante walked in. She could see it in the way the Valentini representatives adjusted their postures, the way Sienna's hand moved briefly to the place on her finger where the ring was supposed to be. An unconscious check. A tell. The ring was not on her finger. Sienna looked at Dante and her expression began its managed reconfiguration toward warmth, toward the performance of a woman greeting her intended, and Dante looked back at her with the expression of a man who had finished making a decision. He did not cross the room to her. He went to the center of the room and stopped, and the room reorganized itself around him the way rooms always reorganize themselves around Dante Marcel, and he looked around at the assembled faces, family, Valentini representatives, attorneys, guests arriving at the edges, and he said, in the quiet voice that made people lean in to hear, "I want to show everyone something." The attorney stepped forward. He had a tablet. On the tablet was the security footage from the study, the message from the prepaid phone, and photographs of the transfer document retrieved from the dressing suite cabinet. Sienna's face went through something she couldn't stop. One of the Valentini representatives, the senior one, a man in his 60s with silver at his temples, and the particular stillness of someone who had survived a long time in his specific professional context, looked at the tablet, and then looked at Sienna, and then looked at Dante, and made a calculation that was visible in the 2-second pause before he chose not to speak. "The ring," Dante said, "is in the custody of my attorney." He looked at Sienna directly. "Where it will remain." The room was very quiet. Sienna looked at him. The composure was cracking at the edges, the hairline fractures of something carefully built beginning to propagate under pressure it hadn't been designed to withstand. She looked at the attorney. She looked at the tablet. She looked at the Valentini representative, who gave her nothing. "This is—" She stopped, started again. "You can't—" "There's one more thing," Dante said. He turned toward the service corridor entrance. He looked directly at the sight line where Mara was standing in the shadow. And he waited. She understood what he was waiting for. She understood it completely. And she felt the specific gravity of the moment, the way you feel the ground tilt under you when something irreversible is about to happen, and you are the thing that makes it irreversible. She stepped out of the shadow and into the room. Every face turned. The 3 women from Saturday night were in the back of the room, and she felt their attention land on her, and she did not look at them. She looked at Sienna, who was looking at her with an expression that had dropped all its layers and showed something underneath that was not composure and not cruelty, but something rawer and more frightened than either. The room was watching Mara. The room was watching Dante watch Mara. And the room, the family members and the Valentini representatives and the attorneys and the guests who had come for a celebration and found themselves in something very different, was recalibrating its understanding of exactly who this woman in the plain work jacket was and why she was standing at the center of this moment. Dante crossed the room toward her. He reached into his jacket pocket. He took out the ring. The same ring that had arrived on Tuesday in its velvet case, that had been on Sienna's finger through the party and off it by morning, that had been locked in a cabinet drawer with a transfer document waiting for a notary who was not going to arrive. The Marcel family ring, the billion-dollar instrument, the thing that connected a century of history to a 9-figure trust to this specific room on this specific night. He held it and he looked at her, and the room held its breath with the collective quality of people who understood they were witnessing something they had not expected to witness and could not look away from. Sienna said his name. Once. Sharp. The sound of a person who has played every card and watched them turned over wrong. Dante did not look at her. He looked at Mara, and Mara looked back at him. And the 3 years of invisibility, and the worn shoes, and the plain housekeeper, and all the versions of herself she'd compressed into careful smallness in the service corridors of this building were still there, still part of her, but they were not the whole of her, and she understood that in this moment they never had been. Dante took her left hand. He didn't ask. He looked at her first, the way he'd been looking at her since Saturday night, with that expression she'd never been able to fully catalog. And what she saw in it now was not a transaction and not a performance for the room and not the particular calculus of a powerful man choosing the most useful option available to him. It was something simpler and more complicated than any of those things, and she recognized it because she'd been carrying a quieter version of it behind her teeth for longer than she was prepared to admit even to herself. She didn't pull her hand back. He placed the ring on her finger. The room made a sound that wasn't quite speech, and wasn't quite silence, but something in the register between them, the collective intake of a group of people whose understanding of the evening's narrative had just been rewritten in real time. Sienna Vale stood in the center of the salon in her white dress and did not move. The composure was gone entirely now, not cracked, but dissolved. And what was underneath it was not the frightened thing Mara had seen a moment ago, but something colder and more specific. The expression of a person who has understood that they have lost not just the move but the board, and that the losing happened earlier than they knew. In a dozen small moments they'd dismissed because the person responsible for those moments had been wearing a work uniform and carrying a cleaning cloth, and they hadn't thought to watch her. The Valentini representative in his 60s looked at the ring on Mara's finger and then looked at Dante with the expression of a man revising a very large document in his head very quickly. "This evening," he said carefully, "has not gone as anticipated." "No," Dante said, "it hasn't." "The alliance is concluded," Dante said, not loudly, not with any performance of force, just the flat fact of it, delivered in his quiet voice that made people lean in. The representative looked at his 3 associates. Something passed between them in the grammar of people who had been in difficult rooms before and knew how to exit them with the minimum additional damage. "Then we'll take our leave," he said. "You will," Dante agreed. They left. The room watched them leave, and then the room turned back to Dante and Mara and the ring on her finger and the specific arrangement of everything that had led to this specific moment. What came after was not clean. Mara would have been suspicious of clean. Clean endings were for stories told by people who hadn't been in the rooms where things actually ended. What came after was loud and layered and sometimes ugly and took much longer than the moment itself. Sienna was escorted from the penthouse within the hour by Dante's attorneys, who had documents for her to review that she was going to be reviewing for a long time. Petra left 3 minutes after Sienna without speaking to anyone, which was its own kind of statement. The 2 men from the sub-basement were no longer in the building. They had been conveyed somewhere Mara didn't ask about and understood she wouldn't get a useful answer to if she did. The guests who had come for a rehearsal dinner stayed in the salon for another 2 hours, drinking better wine than the event had originally planned, because Dante made a decision to let the evening become something other than what it had been set up to be, and the family around him followed his lead, the way families do when the person at the center is clear about direction. There was food, there were conversations happening in corners that were private and probably important, and that Mara was not part of. There was Nico, sitting in one of the salon chairs with a glass of water, and the careful stillness of someone whose ribs were reminding him to be careful, talking to the family attorney with an expression of focused concentration. Mara stood near the east window for a while, alone. She was looking at Manhattan doing its constant thing, the light and the motion and the scale of it, all that human activity compressed into a grid visible from 60 floors up. She had the ring on her finger. It was heavier than she'd expected. Not unpleasantly, just heavier. A physical fact she kept being aware of when she moved her hand, which was a new and strange thing to be aware of. One of the women from Saturday night, the one who had said plain as a paper bag, passed near her on the way to the bar. The woman looked at her. Then she looked at the ring. Then she looked back at Mara's face with an expression that was trying several configurations and not quite settling on any of them. Mara looked back at her with the flat, clear gaze she'd been developing for 34 years. The woman moved on. Dante found her at the window at some point after 9. He came and stood next to her, not touching, both of them looking at the city, and for a moment neither of them said anything, and the silence had the specific quality of a silence between two people who have been through something together and are still located inside it even though it's technically over. "Elena Voss," Mara said. "She'll be back tomorrow morning," he said. "There are things to formalize, documents, the attorneys need to—" "I'm not talking about documents," she said. He was quiet. "Who is she?" Mara said. "The real question." He turned to look at her profile. She kept looking at the city. "She's been watching you for 2 years," he said. "On my behalf." She absorbed that. "And before that," she said, "before 2 years ago." A longer pause. "That's a conversation for tomorrow," he said. She turned to look at him. He was looking at her with the expression she'd finally catalogued sometime in the last hour, when the room had gone quiet and the situation had resolved enough that she'd had processing space she hadn't had before. She knew what it was now. She'd known what it was for a while, probably, in the way you know things you've decided not to know until knowing becomes unavoidable. "You knew," she said. Not accusatory, just the fact of it. "You knew what I was before you hired me." He didn't look away from her. "I knew what you were capable of," he said. "That's not the same thing." "It's close." "Maybe." He looked back at the city. "I needed someone in this building I could trust without them knowing I trusted them. Someone who would see things as they were rather than as they were presented. Someone with enough—" He paused. "With enough actual intelligence to make the right calls without being told what the right calls were. And you couldn't have just hired me for that directly. If you'd known your purpose here, your behavior would have reflected it. People who know they're watching behave like people who know they're watching." He paused. "You needed to be genuinely invisible, which meant you needed to genuinely believe you were just the housekeeper." She let that sit for a moment. She thought about 3 years and 4 months of careful smallness, the worn shoes and the plain jacket, and the lists she kept and the things she kept behind her teeth. She thought about the specific loneliness of that kind of work, the way it shaped you while you were doing it, the way it became hard to tell where the cover ended and the person began. "That's a significant thing to do to someone," she said. "Yes," he said. No qualification, no justification appended, just the acknowledgement, which was more than she'd expected and which landed accordingly. She looked at the ring on her finger. "This," she said. "Tonight. The ring. In front of everyone." She looked at him. "Was that in the plan?" His expression shifted, just slightly. The thing she'd been looking at for 3 days, the unresolved thing, moved again. "No," he said. She believed him. She believed him because she had spent 3 years in proximity to this man cataloging his specific truthfulness, the way it differed from his social performance, and she understood the texture of one versus the other. "There are things I need to know," she said, "about what comes next, about what this means in practical terms, about Elena Voss and whatever conversation we're having tomorrow." She held his gaze. "I'm not going to be invisible again." "I know," he said. "I mean it." "I know you mean it," he said. "That's why the ring is on your finger and not on a table somewhere while lawyers figure out the implications." The city moved outside the window, indifferent and continuous, 60 floors below where 2 people were standing in the aftermath of something that had changed the shape of the night, and probably several things beyond it. "I need to get my things from the locker room," she said. "Your things aren't in the locker room." She looked at him. "Carver moved them to the upper guest suite this afternoon," he said. "After I spoke with him. Before the dinner." "You assumed." "I hoped," he said, which was a different thing, and he said it without looking away. She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the specific chain of decisions that had brought her to this window on this night, the ones she'd made and the ones that had been made for her and the ones she'd made in the space between knowing and not knowing that had turned out to be the most important ones of all. "I have questions," she said. "A lot of them." "I know." "Starting tomorrow." "Starting tomorrow," he agreed. "Tonight," she said. "I want to stand here for a while." He turned back to the window. He stood next to her, and they looked at the city together, the lights of it, the scale of it, the constant and different motion of 10 million lives happening simultaneously below them, and neither of them spoke, and the silence between them was not empty. Nico found her later near 11, when the last of the guests had finally cleared and the salon was in the particular state of organized aftermath that Mara's hands were already itching to address out of habit, and that she told herself firmly she was not going to address tonight. He was moving better than he had 3 hours ago. The careful quality was still there, but he'd found a sustainable version of it, the kind of movement that meant the body had done its initial protest and was now cooperating under duress. "You okay?" he said. It was the kind of question that carried weight when the person asking it had been zip-tied to a chair in a sub-basement 4 hours earlier. "Yes," she said. "Are you?" "I've had better Thursdays." He looked at the ring on her finger. His expression was complex in the way expressions were complex when they were genuine. "He's been an idiot about this for a while, you know, just for reference." "Noted," she said. "I'm not saying that to be—" He stopped. "I'm saying it because you deserve to know the context." He looked at her steadily. "You also deserve to know that I told him about a year ago that if he kept you in the dark about your actual role here beyond a certain point, it was going to become something other than a professional decision. He disagreed with me. And now, Nico said, I'm going to go find the doctor who told me to rest for 48 hours and inform him that 48 hours is not currently available as an option." He paused. "Welcome to the family, Mara. Formally. For whatever that's worth. From me." She looked at him. 34 years of keeping things behind her teeth, and she'd said more to the Marcel brothers in the past 4 days than she'd said to most people in the preceding decade. "It's worth something," she said. He nodded once. He went to find his doctor. At midnight, she was alone in the east-facing guest suite that had been set up with her things. Not many things. She had never accumulated things. A habit that now read differently than it had when she'd developed it. Her uniforms were hanging in the closet, and her shoes were on the floor below them, and the rest of her life fit in a bag that sat on the luggage rack. She sat on the edge of the bed. She held her left hand up in the low light and looked at the ring. The Marcel family ring. The $1 billion instrument. The thing that had been the center of a conspiracy she'd spent 4 days disassembling one careful observation at a time. On her finger. She thought about her mother in Yonkers and made a note to call her tomorrow. She thought about the apartment in the Bronx with the window that faced a brick wall and understood that she would need to address that at some point soon. She thought about Elena Voss and what conversation was coming in the morning and the things she'd kept behind her teeth about herself and why she'd ended up in this specific building 3 years and 4 months ago that were going to have to come out of that particular hiding place. She thought about Dante standing at the center of the salon with the ring in his hand, looking at her. She put her hand down. She lay back on the bed, still in her uniform because she was too tired to change, and she looked at the ceiling of the East Guest Suite and breathed. In and out. The deep, slow breath of a person who has been running at a level of internal intensity that is not sustainable and has just, for the first time in 4 days, been given a moment in which nothing is required of her. Her hands were still cold. They were warming slowly. Below, the building was settling into its nighttime configuration, the security rotation she knew by heart changing over, the systems cycling, the particular quiet of a place that had 60 floors of humanity compressed into it and was, for a few hours, turning that humanity down to a minimum. She was part of this building now in a different way than she had been this morning. She was not entirely sure what that meant yet. She understood it would mean things she hadn't anticipated and require things she hadn't prepared for and produce complications she couldn't currently see the shape of. She understood that a ring was a beginning, not a resolution, and that Dante Marcel was not a simple person, and that the world he occupied was not a simple world. She understood all of that. What she also understood, lying in the guest suite in her work uniform with the ring on her finger and the city 40 floors below and the quiet of the building around her, was that for the first time in 3 years and 4 months, she was not invisible. She was seen. And she was, carefully, precisely, with full awareness of all the complications ahead, going to allow herself to be. She woke at 5:15 without an alarm. Old habit. 3 years of early shifts had built it into her body the way certain things get built in. Not consciously, not through decision, but through the accumulated weight of repetition until the body simply knows and doesn't ask permission anymore. She was awake, and her eyes were open, and the ceiling of the East Guest Suite was gray in the pre-dawn light, and for exactly 3 seconds she existed in the clean space before memory reloaded. Then it reloaded. She lay still for another minute, letting the full inventory of the previous 4 days settle back into position in her mind. The ring was on her finger. She could feel it, that slight foreign weight, present at the edge of her awareness the way a new thing is present before it becomes familiar. She looked at it in the gray light. Still there. Still real. She got up. She showered in the guest suite's bathroom, which was 3 times the size of her bathroom in the Bronx, and she stood under the hot water for longer than necessary because her body was carrying the accumulated physical tension of 4 days of high alert functioning, and the hot water was doing something useful to it. The bruise she'd gotten on her left hip from pressing against the corridor wall in the sub-basement, she hadn't even registered it at the time, had deepened overnight to a dark purple that was impressive in its commitment. She dressed in her own clothes, not a uniform. Jeans, a gray shirt, the kind of practical, unremarkable clothing she wore when she was not in the building in a professional capacity. It felt different, putting on her own clothes here, like a small declaration she hadn't made consciously, but that her hands had made for her. She went downstairs at 6. Elena Voss was already there. Not in the salon or the main foyer, but in Dante's private office, which Mara understood as a statement about where Elena Voss placed herself in the architecture of this household. The door was open. Dante was at his desk. Elena was in the chair across from him, in a dark suit that looked like it had been put on without any awareness of what time it was. The suit of a person for whom time of day was largely an operational consideration rather than a social one. She looked up when Mara appeared in the doorway. Her expression was the same one she had deployed on her arrival the previous afternoon, the direct economical assessment of someone who did not waste the energy of pretending to assess less than she was actually assessing. Dante stood when Mara came in. She noticed this and filed it alongside everything else she was filing. "Sit down," Elena said. Mara sat. She noticed and appreciated that Elena had said it the way you said it to an equal, not the way Dante had said it to her yesterday morning in the salon when the geometry of the room had been arranged to communicate something about the balance of information. This was different. This was 3 people in a room together, and Elena was treating the room accordingly. "I'll tell you who I am," Elena said, "and then I'll answer what you ask. That's the most efficient way to do this." "All right," Mara said. "I work for a federal task force that has been building a case against the Valentini family's financial operations for 4 years. She said it the way you said things that were simply true, without decorating them. Specifically, their exploitation of legitimate family trust structures through coerced and fraudulent alliance agreements. The Marcel Trust was identified as a probable next target approximately 2 years ago." She paused. Dante was approached at that point and agreed to cooperate. Part of that cooperation involved establishing a reliable internal observer inside the household who could document activity without the observation being detectable. Mara looked at Dante. He met her eyes. He didn't look away. "You were selected," Elena continued, "based on a profile that matched the operational requirements. Your background in paralegal work, your criminal justice coursework, your—" She paused, and for the first time something moved across her face that was not pure function. "Your previous situation." "My previous situation," Mara repeated. "The man in Jersey City," Elena said. "What happened 3 years and 8 months ago?" The room became very still. Mara had not heard anyone say that aloud in 3 years and 8 months. She had kept it so thoroughly behind her teeth that sometimes she had almost convinced herself it was a thing that had happened to a different person, in a different life, before the careful, invisible life she'd built in this building. But it had not happened to a different person. It had happened to her, and it had shaped her, and it was the reason she cataloged exits and kept lists and knew the difference between a standard wireless earpiece and a surveillance-grade one. "He's still in prison," Elena said, "in case that's a question." "It's not," Mara said. "I know where he is." Of course she did. She checked once a month, had done for 3 years and 8 months. Your experience with him, Elena said carefully, gave you a specific skill set: pattern recognition, environmental awareness, the ability to function under sustained psychological pressure without external support. She looked at Mara steadily. We needed someone with those skills who also had a legitimate operational reason to be in the building without that reason appearing constructed. The housekeeping job, Mara said. We arranged the opening through an agency Carver used regularly. Elena paused. You applied independently. That part wasn't arranged. We made the opening available and your application was genuine. She looked at Dante again. He was looking at the desk surface, his hands flat on it, and she understood that whatever he was doing with his expression right now was costing him something. You didn't recruit me, she said to him. You let me recruit myself into a situation you'd prepared. Yes, he said, still not looking up. And for 2 years you watched me to see if I was what the profile said I was. Yes. And when it became clear that the Valentini move was coming, we needed you to see it, Elena said, without being told what to see. Because a person who's been told what to look for sees what they've been told to look for and misses everything else. You needed to see it clean. She paused. And you did. Mara sat with that for a moment. She looked at the ring on her finger. She looked at Elena. She looked at Dante, who had finally raised his eyes from the desk and was looking at her with the expression she now fully understood, the one that had been accumulating across 4 days and that she now recognized as the specific expression of a man carrying guilt that he hasn't earned the right to put down yet. The wine, she said. I moved the wine bottles because I saw something wrong, not because I was looking for it. Yes, Elena said. The footage from the study. I saved it because it felt like it mattered, not because I'd been trained to. Yes. The alcove conversation, the ledger, the earpiece from Nico's room. She looked at Elena. None of that was me executing an assignment. That was me seeing things the way I see things. That's correct, Elena said. That's exactly what it was. So the profile was right, Mara said, but it wasn't the whole picture, because the profile didn't account for the fact that I would make the calls I made because that's who I am, not because of what you'd positioned me to do. Elena looked at her for a moment. Something in the older woman's face shifted, just slightly, in the way of someone who is accustomed to being the most precise person in a room and has just encountered precision that matches her own. No, she said. The profile didn't account for that. Profiles don't. She paused. People do. The office was quiet for a moment. What happens now, Mara said, with the case? The documents retrieved from the dressing suite last night, combined with the security footage and the communication evidence from the prepaid phone, give us sufficient grounds to move formally against the Valentini financial operation. Elena's voice was back to its functional register. The 2 men from the sub-basement are in federal custody as of this morning. They're cooperative. She paused in a way that suggested the word cooperative was doing some work. Sienna Vale's attorneys contacted us at 11 last night. She'll be providing testimony in exchange for consideration. She'll walk, Mara said. Reduced exposure, Elena said. Not walking. There's a difference. There's less of a difference than it sounds. Yes, Elena said, without arguing it. There is. Mara looked at Dante. Nico is fine, he said. Physically. The rest is... He stopped. He's handled worse. He said you'd been an idiot about this for a while. She said it without particular inflection. Just the fact of it. Something crossed Dante's face that might, in a different lighting, have been something close to a wince. He said that. He also said welcome to the family. A pause. He was faster than me on that, Dante said. He's younger, she said. Maybe he's less careful. Or more honest. Those aren't the same thing, she said, in your specific case. He looked at her. The expression on his face was the most unguarded she'd seen it, more unguarded than last night at the window, more unguarded than the moment in the salon with the ring in his hand. It was the expression of a man who had been careful for a very long time and was currently in the process of discovering that being careful had costs he hadn't fully invoiced. Elena stood up. She did it with the efficiency of a person who has completed the portion of a meeting that required her and is now freeing up the room for what comes next. "I'll need you to come into the federal office next week," she said to Mara, "to provide a formal statement about the events of the past 4 days. The full sequence." She paused. "After that, your operational involvement concludes. What happens personally after that is not my area." She said this last sentence in the specific tone of a person who is technically staying within their boundaries and is aware that they are doing so. She left the office. The door didn't close all the way. Mara listened to her footsteps cross the marble foyer, and then the sound of the private elevator opening and closing. The office was very quiet. "The paralegal work," Dante said. "The criminal justice courses. The man in Jersey City." He looked at her. "I know the outline. I don't know the specifics." "No," she said. "You don't. You don't have to tell me. I know that." He waited. She looked at the window. The city was doing its morning thing, the light-changing quality as the sun came up somewhere behind the cloud cover. The gray shifting to a lighter gray that was the beginning of something or the continuation of it, depending on how you looked. "He was my employer," she said. "Before the paralegal firm, I was 29. He was someone who presented himself a particular way, and I was someone who hadn't yet developed sufficient suspicion of particular presentations." She kept her voice even. "It took me 14 months to see the pattern clearly enough to document it. Another 3 to have documentation solid enough that it held up." She paused. "The charges that stuck were federal, financial fraud primarily. The rest was... There were other charges. Some stuck. Some didn't." "You built the case yourself," Dante said. "There wasn't anyone else to build it." He was quiet. "The experience," she said, "left me with a specific set of habits. Elena's profile was accurate about that." She looked at him. "What the profile couldn't account for, as she said, is that I didn't come to this building as an asset. I came here to disappear. The Bronx apartment with the window that faces a brick wall and the job where nobody looked at me. That was the plan. Invisible long enough to feel safe again. And instead I started noticing things I couldn't stop noticing," she said. "Because that's the other thing the experience left me with. I can't turn it off. The pattern recognition. It runs whether I want it to or not." She paused. "Sometimes that's useful. Sometimes it's exhausting. Mostly it's both." Dante stood up from the desk. He came around to the front of it and leaned against it, which put him closer to where she was sitting, and she looked up at him. "I owe you more than an apology," he said. "I know that. The apology is still the first thing I owe you, so..." He held her gaze. "I'm sorry. For the specific deception of the past 3 years. For the specific benefits I received from your not knowing your own role here. For every moment that the invisibility you were trying to build became something I was using." He paused. "And for Saturday night." "What specifically about Saturday night?" "I heard those women, in the salon, what they said about you." His jaw was doing the tension thing again. "I didn't stop it." "No," she said. "You didn't." "I was calculating whether intervening would..." "I know what you were calculating," she said. "I do the same thing. That doesn't make it not a thing." "No," he said. "It doesn't." She looked at him for a long moment. This specific man who had constructed a 3-year situation around her without her knowledge, and who had also stood in the center of a room full of his family's enemies and placed his family's ring on her finger, and who had, she was increasingly certain, made that decision in a moment that had not been calculated. She was good at telling the difference. She had built the skill the hard way. "Why the ring?" she said. "Last night, in that specific moment, what was the actual reason?" He looked at her steadily. "Because I'd been making the wrong calls about you for 2 years, and I wanted to make the right one. That's still a calculation. The other reason," he said, "is that I've spent 3 years watching you move through this building, and I have never once, in 3 years, seen you be anything other than exactly who you are. Not in front of me. Not in front of anyone." He paused. In my specific world, that is not a small thing. That is possibly the rarest thing. She sat with that. I'm not the same as the woman you watched, she said. Or I'm not only that. There are things you don't know. I know. Things that will be complicated. I know that too. I have a mother in Yonkers who's going to have questions I don't know how to answer yet. Something shifted in his expression. The thing that might have been a wince again, but softer this time, edged with something that was almost amusement, and that made him look, briefly, like a version of himself that was less managed. I have a brother with broken ribs who is going to have opinions, he said, loudly, for the foreseeable future. He already started. He always starts early. He looked at her. We can handle complicated. I'm not asking permission, she said. I'm establishing a fact. I know, he said. I'm agreeing with the fact. She stood up. They were close now in the way that the space in front of a desk made you close when one person was leaning against it and the other was standing up from the chair in front of it. Close enough that she could see the specific quality of his attention, the way it was entirely on her and had been entirely on her since she'd walked in the door, which was itself a thing she was still calibrating the weight of. She held up her left hand between them. This is a real thing, she said. Not an operational decision, not a move. Yes, he said. I need to know it's that before anything else. It's that, he said. And then, because she was watching for calculation and found none. It's only that. She lowered her hand. She looked at him for another moment. I'm going to call my mother, she said. Of course. And then I'm going to need coffee, a lot of it. I'll tell the kitchen. And then, she said, you're going to tell me everything, the full picture, not the outline Elena gave me, everything you know about what I was placed here to do and what you observed and what you decided based on those observations. She held his gaze. All of it. All of it, he agreed. Starting today. Starting today. She went to find a phone. She called her mother at 7:12. Her mother picked up on the second ring, which was normal. Her mother was an early riser, a woman who had spent 40 years waking before dawn for reasons that had changed over time, but whose body had never been informed of the changes. Mara. The specific warmth of her mother's voice saying her name, compressed into 2 syllables, was the same as it had always been, and something in Mara's chest did the thing it always did when she heard it, a settling, like a plumb line finding vertical. You haven't called in 2 weeks. I know, I'm sorry. Are you all right? Mara stood at the east window, the same one where she and Dante had stood last night, looking at the same city doing its different hour version of itself. The morning light was coming in properly now, thin and pale but real, and the buildings across the skyline were beginning to pick up color. I'm all right, she said. I have some things to tell you. Not right now. I need to come see you, this week, if I can. Is it good things or bad things? Mara looked at the ring on her finger. She looked at the city. She thought about the sub-basement and the wine bottles and the alcove conversation and the ledger and 23 seconds of security footage and a prepaid phone in a garment bag and 2 men currently in federal custody and a woman in a white dress who was currently in the process of discovering the shape of her own consequences. She thought about 3 years of invisibility and what it had cost and what it had built and how it was possible for both of those things to be true simultaneously. Both, she said, mostly good. Her mother was quiet for a moment in the specific way of her mother's quiet, which was not empty but thoughtful, the quiet of a woman who had raised a daughter alone and had developed a refined ability to hear what was underneath the thing being said. You sound different, her mother said. I know. Different how? Not suspicious. Curious. With the particular precision of someone who knew her well enough to ask precisely. Mara thought about how to answer that. She looked at the ring. She thought about standing in the center of a room that had spent 3 years looking through her and looking back. Like myself, she said. More than I have in a while. Her mother was quiet again. Then, come Saturday. I'll make the soup you like. Okay, Mara said. Saturday. She hung up and stood at the window for another minute and let the specific warmth of that brief exchange do what it did, which was remind her that there was a world outside this building and that she was part of it and that it had been waiting for her without complaint. The federal office visit happened on Wednesday. Elena met her in a conference room on the 14th floor of a building in Lower Manhattan that had the specific institutional quality of spaces designed to be functional without being memorable. There was a lawyer present, Mara's own lawyer, a woman named Carla Reyes, who had been recommended by Dante's attorney and whom Mara had spoken to on Monday for 2 hours and found to be exactly the kind of person she wanted in a room with her when giving a formal statement to a federal task force. Direct, precise, allergic to theater. The statement took 4 hours. Mara gave it in the same order she'd given Dante the full account in his office, which was chronological and specific and devoid of interpretation except where interpretation was asked for, because interpretation offered without being asked was where stories got complicated, and she wanted her story to remain simple. Here is what I observed. Here is when I observed it. Here is what I did with the observation. Elena listened without visible reaction. The other task force member present, a man in his 40s who had been introduced as Agent Kowalski and who had the careful, slightly tired quality of someone who had been working a long case for a long time, took notes in a small notebook with a mechanical pencil and occasionally asked follow-up questions that were specific enough to tell her he'd read the preliminary documentation thoroughly. At the end of the 4 hours, Elena walked her to the elevator. The Valentini financial case goes to a grand jury in 3 months, she said. Your testimony may be needed. Carla will be notified. Understood. The 2 men from the sub-basement have been charged. Sienna Vale has provided testimony consistent with yours and has entered a cooperation agreement. She paused. The transfer document she signed will be used as evidence. What about the notary? Mara said. The one listed on the document. Also in cooperation. Elena said it with the specific flatness of someone who had seen a lot of cooperation from people who had run out of other options. The elevator arrived. Mara stepped toward it and stopped. The profile, she said. The one that identified me. Were there other candidates? Elena looked at her. 3. Why me? A pause. In Elena Voss, pauses were always functional. She didn't pause from uncertainty. She paused to select. The others had the skills, she said. You had the reasons. She held Mara's gaze. There's a difference in how a person functions when they're operating from skills versus when they're operating from reasons. Skills can be trained. Reasons are yours. Mara thought about that. The man in Jersey City. You spent 14 months building a case while living inside the situation that made the case necessary, Elena said. Under sustained pressure with no external support, and you built it correctly, ironclad. She paused again. Most people in that situation don't build anything. They survive it or they don't. You built something. The elevator was waiting. That's not a small thing either, Mara said. No, Elena said. It isn't. Mara got in the elevator. The doors closed. She rode down 14 floors in the functional anonymity of the federal building's elevator and stepped out into the lobby and walked out onto the street where Carla was waiting and the city was doing its midday thing, full density, all the lives at full volume, and she stood on the sidewalk for a moment and let it hit her, all of it, the noise and the motion and the scale and the specific sensation of standing in the middle of it as a visible person with reasons that were hers. You all right? Carla said. Yes, Mara said, and meant it in a way she hadn't meant it in a long time. She moved her things from the Bronx on Thursday. Not many things, as established. The apartment had been furnished when she rented it, and she'd added little beyond the personal, which in her case meant her books. There were more of those than anything else. 2 boxes, and her clothes, and the small items that had accumulated on shelves and in drawers over 3 years that were the physical residue of a life lived quietly and without acquisition. She did it herself. Dante offered men. She told him no. This part she needed to do herself, which he understood without needing it explained, which was one of the things about him that she was still calibrating the significance of, his ability to understand certain things without needing them explained. The apartment looked smaller when it was empty. It always did. 3 years she'd slept in this room with its window facing the brick wall of the adjacent building, and she stood in the middle of it empty-handed with the boxes already in the car downstairs, and looked at the mark on the wall where a nail had been, and the slight compression in the carpet where the small bookshelf had stood, and the specific quality of the light, which was unchanged from every other day she'd woken up to it. She had been safe here. That was the true thing about this apartment. That was also the entire thing about this apartment. She had come here to be safe, and she had been, in the specific way of a person who has traded visibility for security and knows they're doing it and has decided the trade is worth it. She didn't regret it. That was not what this feeling was. It was something else, a kind of acknowledgement, looking at the empty room, of what that specific version of herself had cost, and what it had been worth, and what it had been protecting, and what it was no longer necessary to protect in the same way. She turned off the light. She closed the door. She left the key with the super, a man named Diego, who had spent 3 years being professionally incurious about the tenant in 4C, and who shook her hand when she handed him the key with the expression of someone who has decided to ask none of the questions his face was clearly generating. "Good luck," he said. "Thank you," she said, and meant that too. She moved into the East Guest Suite as a temporary arrangement and understood, from the way the household organized itself around this fact without comment, that the temporary was a formality everyone was treating as such. Carver, who had absorbed the full revelation of the past week with the adaptive efficiency of a man who had survived considerable operational turbulence over the course of his career, and had decided that the most professional response to all of it was to increase his clipboard usage, had already added her preferences to the kitchen brief and had updated the household access documentation with the status that was not housekeeper and not guest, but something new that the existing categories didn't quite accommodate. She found him making this update on Friday morning, and he looked up at her from the document with his pen held in the not clicking position, which she'd learned over 3 years meant he was in a mode of genuine focus rather than anxious displacement. "There's no category that fits," he said. "Make a new one," she said. He looked at her. Then he looked back at the document. Then he wrote something and clicked the pen twice and moved on to the next item. Nico's ribs were officially bruised, not broken, and he'd been told by the doctor to rest for a week and had been resting for approximately 36 hours before deciding that the operational situation following the Thursday events required his involvement regardless of what his ribs had to say about it. He worked from the sitting room on the upper floor and communicated primarily through his phone and the occasional appearance in whatever room Mara was in, where he would make a pointed comment about something tangential to the actual thing he'd come to say, and then leave. On Friday afternoon, he found her in the kitchen, where she was making her own coffee because the habits held, and he stood in the doorway and said, "He's not good at this." "At what specifically?" "At the part where you know everything about the situation, and the situation is personal." He leaned against the doorframe with the careful posture of someone protecting their left side. "He's good at the parts where information is kept separate from feeling. He's been doing that his whole life, separate. This is not separate." "I know. I'm not saying this as a warning. I know that too." He looked at her. "Are you good at it? The personal part?" She considered. "I don't know yet," she said. "I haven't had a lot of recent practice." He nodded once, the nod of someone receiving an honest answer and respecting it. "He's trying," Nico said. "For the record." "I can see that," she said. "That's not the question." "What's the question?" She thought about it. She poured her coffee. She looked at the liquid surface in the cup, which told her nothing useful, and then she looked at Nico. "Whether trying looks like this," she said, after a while, "or whether trying looks like something else once the crisis is over and the situation becomes ordinary." Nico was quiet for a moment. "That's a fair question." "Yes." "I don't have the answer." "I know. I'm not asking you for it." She picked up the cup. "I'm going to find it out the regular way." "Which is?" "Time," she said. "And paying attention." She moved toward the door. "Which, as it turns out, I'm good at." She and Dante had this full conversation on Saturday evening, 2 days after the federal office, the day she came back from her mother's house in Yonkers, with the soup still warm in her and the specific settling that being in her mother's kitchen produced still present in her system. They sat in the private office, which had become their room for the conversations that mattered, the ones that needed four walls and a closed door rather than the performed intimacy of the salon or the formal neutrality of the conference spaces. He told her everything, the full sequence from his first contact with Elena's task force 2 years ago, through the construction of the housekeeping position, through the 2 years of watching her function without knowing she was being watched, through the moment. He identified it precisely 8 months ago during a routine staff review, when his assessment of her shifted from operational to something he didn't have a clean category for. 8 months ago. She'd been carrying the earpiece from Nico's room for 4 days when she'd probably been under a different kind of scrutiny for 8 months. She took that in without comment. He told her about the Saturday night of the engagement party, what he'd seen standing in the archway while the 3 women spoke. He told her about the specific quality of her back when she'd turned away from them, the way she'd continued working with her posture unchanged, and what he'd understood about her in that moment in a way he hadn't understood before. "A paper bag," she said. "Yes." "And you stood there." "Yes." He held her gaze. "I've thought about that every day since, what it would have cost me to stop it, and what it would have changed. I don't have a justification." "You were calculating." "I'm always calculating." "So am I," she said. "The difference is I can see when the calculation is a reason and when it's a defense." He took that without argument. She noticed he had stopped arguing with the things she said that landed on him, which was different from his initial mode and which told her something about how this specific week had changed his specific position. "What happened in Jersey City?" she said. "You know the outline, you said." "Yes." "Then you know that what I built there—" She stopped, chose the next words carefully. "What it required me to be during those 14 months, to function, while also seeing clearly, while also not showing what I could see." She looked at him. "That's not something you recover from completely. It makes you a certain kind of person, and you stay that kind of person. The habits stay. The way of seeing stays." "I know." Elena put me in a situation where those habits were exactly what was needed, which means she understood something about me that I understand about myself. She paused. "I need to know you understand it too, not as an asset, as a fact about who you're choosing." He looked at her for a long moment. "You see everything," he said. "You always have. You see it and you hold it and you decide what to do with it on your own terms." He paused. "That's not a liability I'm managing. That's the specific person I want in my life." She looked at him. She was good at detecting the falseness in statements like that, the seam where calculation met performance, and she found no seam. "Okay," she said. "Okay," he said. She looked at the window, the city outside, perpetually itself. "My mother wants to meet you," she said, something on his face, the almost wince again, and then something warmer underneath it. "When?" he said. "Soon," she said. "She'll make soup. It's a test." "What kind of test?" "Whether you eat the soup or ask about the soup," she said. "There's a right answer." "Eat the soup," he said immediately. She looked at him. "Yes," she said. "Eat the soup." The case against the Valentini financial operation took 14 months to complete. Mara gave testimony twice before the grand jury. Clear, chronological, devoid of theater. The same qualities that had made her case in Jersey City hold up years before. Carla Reyes sat beside her both times and said very little because very little needed to be said. Sienna Vale received a reduced sentence commensurate with her cooperation. She served it without public statement. Mara didn't follow the details closely. She had done what the situation required, and the situation had proceeded to its own resolution without requiring her ongoing attention, which was how she preferred situations to proceed. The 2 men from the sub-basement received sentences that were not reduced. The Valentini financial operation, as Elena had described it, collapsed under the weight of its own documentation over the course of those 14 months. The mechanism by which it had targeted legitimate family trusts through fraudulent alliance agreements was detailed in legal documents that Mara read in their entirety, partly because she was a material witness and partly because understanding the complete shape of something that had moved through her life seemed like the minimum she owed herself. The Marcel Trust remained intact. Nico oversaw the operational restructuring of the family's holdings in the aftermath of the case, working with the attorney whose latex gloves had documented the dressing suite cabinet and a small team of financial advisors whose identities and backgrounds Mara did not ask about and understood she didn't need to ask about. The work took most of a year and produced, at its conclusion, a structure that the attorney described as substantially more resilient to external exploitation, which was the kind of thing that sounded dry on paper and represented, in practice, significant work done well. Nico's ribs healed in 6 weeks. He celebrated by informing Mara, in the kitchen, during one of his tangential comment appearances, that she made better coffee than anyone else in the building and that this fact should be noted. "I'm not making your coffee," she said. "I'm not asking you to make my coffee," he said. "I'm noting a fact." She looked at him. "Welcome," he said, and left. A year and 4 months after the Thursday that had changed the shape of everything, Mara stood at the east window in the morning and watched the city do its early thing and held her coffee in both hands and felt the ring on her left finger, which was no longer a foreign weight, but had become exactly what jewelry eventually became when you wore it long enough. An extension, a presence that was yours. The apartment in the Bronx was gone. The window that faced the brick wall was someone else's now. Her books were on shelves in a room in this building that was hers. In a way, the guest suite had been only temporarily, and her mother had visited twice and eaten in this kitchen and met Dante and said nothing to Mara about him directly afterward, except that his posture was very straight and his eyes were honest, which from her mother was a complete review. She was not invisible. That was the true summary of the year and 4 months. She was not invisible, and the specific vigilance required to maintain invisibility was no longer running its background calculation every waking hour, which had freed up a portion of her cognitive capacity that she had apparently been using for other things, because she read more and slept better and found, somewhat to her surprise, that she had opinions about things she hadn't previously been paying attention to, and that voicing those opinions in a room that listened to them was a different experience from keeping them behind her teeth. She still cataloged exits. She still noted anomalies. She still kept lists, though the lists had changed in character. Less survival documentation, more the ordinary notation of a person moving through a life she was invested in rather than managing from a careful distance. She still couldn't turn it off. The pattern recognition. It ran. Dante had stopped finding this quality unsettling, if he ever had, and had arrived at some point in the first year at a mode of treating it the way you treated any fundamental aspect of a person you'd chosen, not as something to manage, but as something that was simply there, that was part of the whole, that you took in because you'd taken in the whole, and the whole was what you wanted. She understood this because she watched him. She watched him the way she watched everything, and what she saw consistently and across the full range of circumstances that a year and 4 months produced, the difficult ones and the ordinary ones, and the ones that were simply the texture of 2 people living in proximity and figuring out the shape of that proximity day by day, was a man who showed up, not perfectly, not without friction, but consistently and without calculation, and with the specific quality of attention she'd told him she needed and that he had not yet failed to provide. That was not a small thing. She knew better than most people exactly how small a thing it usually was and how large it was when it wasn't. Behind her, she heard him come in, the specific sound of his walk. She didn't turn around. He came and stood beside her at the window. He had his own coffee. They stood together in the early light, not touching, looking at the city that was 60 floors below and going about its enormous indifferent business, 10 million lives in motion simultaneously, none of them aware of the 2 people at the window or the year and 4 months of wait that had brought them there. "Your mother called," he said. "I know. I'll call her back. She wants to know if we're coming to Yonkers this weekend." "We are," she said. "I told her last week." "She asked me specifically," he said. "I think she's checking whether I know." "She does that," Mara said. "She's checking whether you pay attention." "Do I pass?" She looked at him. The morning light was doing something to the line of his jaw that she had stopped noting as a detail and had started noting as familiar, which was its own kind of distance traveled. "You told her yes," she said. "Yes." And you knew the right weekend. Saturday. She's making the soup with the... Yes, Mara said. You pass. He looked at her. The expression on his face was the one she'd finally and fully catalogued in the months since the night with the ring. Not calculated, not managed, not the performed composure of a man maintaining position. Just the face of a person who was looking at the specific person they'd chosen and finding the choosing to be, still, after all of it, the right call. She looked back at him. She looked at him the way she looked at everything, with the pattern recognition running, with the habit of noting, with the 34 years of accumulated observation that had cost her what it had cost her and built what it had built. What she saw was this man, this window, this city, this morning, this life which was hers, which she had built from the specific materials that difficulty and patience and the refusal to stop paying attention had made available to her. She turned back to the window. She drank her coffee. The city moved below them, continuous and enormous and entirely itself. And the light kept coming in, and the morning kept becoming what mornings become. And neither of them said anything because nothing needed to be said. This was the shape of it now. Not the crisis, and not the invisibility, and not the 4 days of everything moving too fast, and not the moment in the salon with the ring in his hand. All of that had happened, and none of it was gone, and all of it had led here, to this window, to this ordinary, unremarkable morning that was hers in a way no morning had been hers in longer than she could precisely measure. She had been the woman they didn't see. She had seen everything, and in the end, seeing everything clearly, herself included, had turned out to be the only thing that mattered. The rest had followed from that, as the rest always does. She finished her coffee. She set the cup down. She looked at the ring on her finger briefly, the way you look at a thing that has become yours and that you still, sometimes, need to confirm is real. It was real. She went to call her mother.